Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New America. My name's Ian Wallace. I am a senior fellow here at New America and the co-director of the New America Cybersecurity Initiative. I'm conscious that 9:30 on a Monday morning is a demanding time to get a crowd together for any kind of think tank event. So thank you very much for coming and being here on time. And we expect other people will run in, but we have a lot to talk about, so we're going to get cracking. Firstly, for those people who do not know New America, we are a non-partisan think tank. We've existed for 15 years. We cover the full gamut of public policy issues, but with a sort of common theme of technology running through those and sort of reinventing America for the 21st century. The one thing that sort of is consistent through all of technology, of course, is securing that technology, and we believe that's going to be increasingly important. So our cybersecurity initiative has existed for 2 years. We are fortunate enough to be funded generously by the Hewlett Foundation, which gives us the flexibility to focus on those things that we think are important, and we're very pleased to be able to do that. A quick word about this event. This stage was the venue for the rollout of the President's National Cybersecurity National Action Plan in February with Michael Daniel and his White House team, which of course, as you know, include the announcement of a commission on enhancing national cybersecurity. And we have, throughout the period of the Commission's work, remained close to the Commission and been sort of interested in what they do, not least because we were very pleased to see that several of the areas in which the Commission was tasked, particularly state and local government, but also areas that depend on states and local governments for the policy, education, insurance, etc., are subjects that we have been working on and felt it was very important to keep track of and indeed support the Commission's work. And so we've been talking to Kiersten, who you'll meet shortly, and looking at how we can have an event. And we were very pleased, we are very pleased to have the first opportunity to talk to Kiersten since the publication of the report, hear what the President had to say about it, and perhaps most importantly, how we think it's going to be implemented going forward. We also have been in our state and local work, been working very closely with the National Governors Association. Pleased to have Blute with us, who again we'll introduce in a moment. And he's very kindly agreed to sort of sit on the panel and anchor this conversation in the broader context, not just focusing on the federal government, important though that is. Before we talk to Kiersten and Tim, I just want to give a little bit of a sense of how we will run the day. We're going to have this conversation for 45 minutes, finishing at 10:15, and then run into a series of 3 panels, digging into a little bit more detail on some of the things that the report focuses on, or indeed at least it tees up for sort of future conversations. Firstly on education, second on regulation and legislation, and third one on the role of the states, specifically in what they do in enhancing national cybersecurity. We'll wrap that up all around about 12:15. A couple of admin points before we get going. If anyone needs a restroom, we're going to keep this rolling through, but if anyone needs to step out, feel free. Restrooms back here and back behind the stairs over there. Feel free to refresh yourself with coffee and food if you feel the need. And we will be live tweeting this and live streaming it. So if you want to participate, we'll be live tweeting from our @NewAmCyber address using the hashtag WON whole of nation cyber. Okay, let's get cracking. So welcome, Kiersten and Tim. Kiersten Todt is the executive director of the Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity. position which she's been in since the beginning of the commission in February 2016. Prior to that, she was president and managing partner of Liberty Group Ventures, in which capacity she supported, amongst other things, the drafting of the NIST framework, which is a very important part of this administration's cybersecurity policy. Back in the past, she has done various roles in the executive and the legislature, in the White House Domestic Policy Office, on the Hill, the Homeland Security Committee of the Senate, and her role in establishing the DHS. Tim is the program director of the Homeland Security and Public Safety Division of the National Governors Association, which is a big job in any circumstance, but this year, given Governor McAuliffe's decision to make cybersecurity the key policy issue for his term in charge of the NGA, has been a particularly important position. Prior to joining the NGA, Tim was with the FBI and spent some time also with the United States Treasury. So, let's get cracking. Kiersten, I guess the first question to ask is, to summarize a sort of 100-page document, what does the report say, and how did you get there?
There's a joke in there. I know, and I'm not quite sure what that is yet at 9:30, not enough coffee. It says great things, Ian, lots of great things. I think, you know, as many of you know, in the executive order, the requirements or the tasking from this president was very broad. There were 8 issues that were called out, and one of the things that the commission was aware of but didn't truly address till probably August, September was how do we weave these 8 issues in together in a thoughtful way that has broader themes. And in addition to the 8 that the president asked for, the commission added on two others, which were international and insurance. And what the commission ended up doing was we divided them into these 6 imperatives that are broader themes. And I would say that a first sort of broad brush approach to what we ended up putting forth were 5 ideas. I mean, the six imperatives look at the Internet of today, security of today, innovation and the securing of the future of the digital economy, the future and the status quo and the future of the government, looking at workforce, looking at international issues, what's the role of the consumer, and again, how the government fits together. But when we looked at kind of what we heard through these 6 public meetings and through the RFI, one of the first things that came out pretty strongly was this idea of convergence. In a world where the physical and cyber are converging, it became obvious to us both what we were looking at, but then also what we were seeing in day-to-day life, that it's time to get serious about the security of the Internet of Things. And so we put forth in this report very strong recommendations for doing so. The second was looking at how to get the federal government house in order, the cyber house in order. So clarifying roles and responsibilities for government, because we heard a lot from industry that it was unclear to industry what government was doing. And then also looking at what is the true collaboration mechanism between the government and the private sector before, during, and after an event. We also looked at the consumer specifically and understanding that it's critical that the consumer needs to be educated and aware and takes responsibility for his or her cybersecurity. Also understanding that it has a role not just for personal cybersecurity, but a broader cybersecurity, as we saw with the recent Mirai attacks. But then also this longer-term goal of understanding how do you move cybersecurity away from the end user, move it up the chain to the manufacturer and the developer. It's not always, as much as we can educate the consumer, you can't expect all of that responsibility to rest on them. We talked a lot about workforce, and we can go into that in a little bit more detail around the recommendations for both training the current workforce, because oftentimes it's not about that we need more people, although that came, that was certainly part of it, but it's also ensuring that the current workforce is trained appropriately. And then finally, and this was one of the themes that we'll talk a little bit about, but kind of underlies a lot of this, is that our #1 cybersecurity research and development priority really needs to be about security in design. And that's a catchphrase right now. It's already becoming one of these jargon phrases, but I can go into more detail specifically around how do you bake security, privacy, and trust into the development of interconnected devices. One of the interesting things that I'll just wrap up with quickly was that when we started talking about IoT and critical infrastructure, there was a sense of how do you encourage the security for life-saving devices. Like pacemakers, things where life was critical, driverless cars. But what was clear over the course of the commission through Mirai and others was that if a baby monitor, it's your weakest link, which is a lesson that we continue to learn in cybersecurity. It's how do you secure the weakest link across the board to ensure security across all of these other issues.
I want to dig into workforce and R&D and what have you, but before we do, one of the sort of implicit taskers, or explicit taskers in fact, was looking at this as sort of whole of nation cybersecurity, hence our hashtag for this event. What did you learn from the meetings that the Commission had and people that you spoke to about the federal government's role in working with others and indeed others' role in working with the federal government in order to sort of take some of these issues forward?
So I think, whether you're talking about industry, state and local government, small businesses, one of the things that we heard was this relationship between government and the private sector, government and state and federal government and state and local governments is critical. And rather than just putting forth a recommendation that says we need to improve relationships between the government and, pick your box, small businesses, whatever, it was really understanding what that means. And one of the key findings from this was understanding that government is quite good at incident response, and we have a lot of procedures, policies. PPD 41 just came out that talks about how do you respond to an incident. What we have not done as effectively is what does that collaboration look like before an event? And so we've proposed something called NCP3, which is a collaboration mechanism that really looks at, it kind of takes a page from the DoD playbook around deliberate planning, joint planning, understanding what does the government do well before an event or do well in planning and training, and what does industry do well. And we have some specifics about it, which I'm happy to go into more detail, but it's understanding what that collaboration mechanism is. And to simply say we need to do better at it isn't enough. In this report, there's this tension, or I would say balance, reconciliation of strategic recommendations, but then also being prescriptive where we thought that was really important. And the Commission was adamant about taking the time to reconcile those two, that balance. And so in a case like this, where we've heard a lot around government needs to do more, we need to have better information sharing, better relationships, the Commission went a lot deeper into the specifics of what that looks like.
And we may well come back to that. Before we do, Tim, that's a good point to bring you in, and just to say, to ask you, having looked at the report and done also quite a lot of meetings around the country, what do you think the nation's governors need from the federal government going forward in order to play their part in cyber securing the nation?
Sure. Thanks, Ian. And it's interesting you asked that question, because I think one of the state and local recommendations in the report was around the National Guard. So I would lead with that as an example. The states and the governors can use continued collaboration and clarification from the federal government. I think it's always important to understand what are the roles and responsibilities, how do the federal agencies see them. PPD 41 was a step in the right direction. I think clarifying the rules of the road between DHS, between the FBI, between the White House, I think continued clarification on how federal agencies are going to work together with industry and with the states in preparing for an incident, but also in responding to an incident, as Kiersten pointed out. And then I think continue just collaboration, especially around information sharing and intelligence sharing. A lot of the state officials that we meet with, that's one of the continued questions that they're always raising. How can I get more of the key intelligence and information that I need to make informed risk and threat-based decisions, and where can I get that from? And the answer is frequently the federal government. Certainly industry plays a key role there, but I think continued collaboration from the federal government. So I think clarification and collaboration be the two key areas.
Cool. Kiersten, do you want to tell us a little bit more about that sort of deliberate planning and sort of collaboration as set out in the report?
Sure. So the proposal, one of the recommendations talks about this NCP3, and this is an advisory board that takes a page out of the President's Intel Advisory Board. So industry is represented, the government's represented. And the idea here is to truly understand what government does well, what industry does well, what government needs, and what industry needs. And to get specific, I mean, it's along the lines of if I'm a company and I'm looking on my networks and I detect a threat, particularly if it's coming from a nation state, to then work with the government, because arguably the federal government knows nation state threats and TTPs, techniques and procedures better than the industry, and being able to share that information and truly understand what that threat detection looks like. But the idea that industry and government would be collaborating ahead of time is part of this critical element. The other part is joint deliberate planning, like the Pentagon, is important in understanding not just how you're going to walk through something, but understanding what the resources are that are available and how you exercise and execute them. And I think that's been one of the key issues, is truly understanding how to utilize those resources, what resources become available in the case of an event, and then how the government and the industry will work together to effectively respond to an event and to work collaboratively to do so.
Which leads on to a question about workforce. You know, it's all very well having the right plans, but if you don't have the people to do anything about it, then yeah, and that's going to be true at the federal level just as much as at the state and local level. What are you recommending in the report, and how much confidence do you have that, you know, this most tricky of issue is going to be addressed going forward?
So obviously workforce is significant, and there are already a lot of federal government efforts underway. OPM and OMB came out with something this summer, and there are a lot of different stages. I would say that workforce has a lot of different pieces to it that the commission looked at. The first is this problem. What we heard in our very first meeting was, so you're going to look at workforce, understand, we heard this from a panelist, and we evolved this, but this was an important starting point. Understand that the issue is not that we don't have enough people, it's that the people who we have aren't trained appropriately. So that is one premise upon which we worked. Then we worked off of the fact that a lot of people say there just aren't enough people in this workforce, and so how do you train the people to be appropriate? That's all the very short term, and to the point that I was just making about where the commission went strategic and where it went prescriptive, we get very prescriptive on workforce, all the way down to the numbers. It's probably maybe the more specific set of recommendations that we have in the report. Combined with the fact that if we are simultaneously supporting automation, big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, that there is this sense that ultimately what's going to happen is the need for the workforce will diminish because a lot of this is going to be automated. If you look at the Zumwalt, and it talks about how you had hundreds and hundreds of sailors, and now because it's so automated, it's 167 sailors. Or if you look at Goldman Sachs that says we're going to reduce our workforce by 50% in 5 years. These are long-term goals. Now, our states, our small businesses are not Zumwalt-like or Goldman Sachs-like, but it gives us a sense of where this is going. But is it going to happen immediately? Absolutely not. We're looking at a much longer-term trajectory. But it's an important goal that we're reconciling with what the immediate near terms are. So some of the things that we talk about in the report is training this current workforce through boot camp-like ideas, through exchange programs with industry, and then also being able to create a cybersecurity profession that is ingrained in our culture the way being a teacher, a doctor, a construction worker, all of those things are. And one of the ways that you do that is by educating on cybersecurity at a very young age. And so what we talk about is, you know, if your first grader is getting an iPad to do work in school, at that same time, he or she should be learning about cybersecurity. He or she should be learning about all of those elements so that cybersecurity is a part of the culture, so that it's not an auxiliary issue that's baked on in college when it's like, hey, have you ever heard about cybersecurity as a profession? This is something that is growing, and that's part of growing the workforce organically. So this is an interesting area in the report because we have very short-term, medium-term, and long-term solutions that are very specific.
And we have a fantastic education program here, so our next panel is going to be focusing specifically on that issue, not least because many of the levers actually sit with the state and local governments. And I'd love to dig in more of that now, but in the interest of time, let's move forward and just talk about the technology and the R&D that you mentioned earlier. This is, as we constantly tell people, not just a technology issue, but it is a technology issue. What are you recommending in the report in terms of investments in research and development, and how will that be carried forward and flow down to other parts of the country, not just the federal government?
So it's an interesting point. As you said, it's technology, but it's not. I think, early on when people would say, what are you hearing? What are some of the things that you didn't expect to hear, or the issues that are rising to the surface? And without a doubt, it was human behavior and incentives. So it was understanding that cybersecurity is technology, but at the end of the day, the human behavior around security is what's critical. And creating the appropriate incentives for appropriate human behavior and also business behavior is very important. Having said that, what I talked a little bit about at the beginning with the role of the consumer in cybersecurity, it's looking at what is the research that can be done on usability. So understanding how do humans respond to certain technologies so that doing the right thing is easy to do and doing the wrong thing is hard to do. And so we talk a little bit about investment into the human behavior component. But then again, looking at what are the standards and appropriate policies in place to ensure that manufacturers are truly baking security into the design and the development of devices. And what we heard a lot was, first to market is often more important than secure to market. And I think one of the greatest examples or demonstrations that we heard that industry is actually very open to this was one that we heard at a meeting, but then also one that we heard in media. So at a meeting, we heard from a senior level official at Intel to say, give us standards, because if you can somehow put bounds around this market, we will all operate more effectively in our research and design and development, because we know that we have constraints. If there's no constraint here, and if it's just about getting the best flashy product to market first without any security concerns, it creates this chaos. What we also saw, as many of you may remember, I think it was in September, NHTSA came out with a set of guidelines for driverless cars. And you didn't see the automobile industry with their arms up and just freaking out saying, how could they do this? They said there was an acceptance of that to say, okay, we've got these not restrictions, but guidelines and guiding principles. And that's one of the things, these elements are the things that we talk about in trying to use those as examples of best practices to move forward.
So even in the short time that we've been talking, you have set out an enormous agenda.
Mm-hmm.
At least part of...
I knew you had a boring year next year, so I thought I would just, lay them all out for you.
Things are very quiet in Washington right now.
Yeah.
So in terms of taking this forward, an important part of, I guess, success or failure is going to be how the at least federal government is organized to take this forward. Mm-hmm. And at least some of your recommendations, the ones that receive the most immediate coverage, I guess, have been those where you've recommended changes, different positions and organizations. Can you just talk a little bit through that and what that could mean for others, including sort of state and locals?
Sure. And so, what I would say is it's not so much about changing the structure, but it's about solidifying and empowering the structure. So what we talk about is we elevate the current special assistant to the president to an assistant position to empower that role so that there is this authority in the executive branch. We look at...
And just for those people who are not
Sorry,
as familiar with the White
Sorry.
House...
I didn't use acronyms, I just used...
What is the significance of that sort of nuanced change in role?
It's a direct line, so it works through the head of the National Security Council, and it creates more of a direct line to the president. And if we can make the analogy to counterterrorism, when the president then when there's a counterterrorism or Homeland Security issue, the president turns to Lisa Monaco, who is his assistant for counterterrorism and Homeland Security. Right now, that portfolio of cybersecurity is also part of Lisa's role, but it's also, it has other homes throughout government. And so what this is it's a position that allows the president and the president-elect to have an individual, so when OPM happens, he knows who to turn to say, how are we going to look at this across the board? And it constructs and aligns with what the OMB positions are, so the new CISO, the CIO, and we go into that, and without getting into too much inside the beltway, we structure, looking at that structure. What's important and what we knew from the beginning, and this is a really important point, particularly now, is that this commission was nonpartisan from the beginning. In fact, 4 of the commissioners were chosen by Senate and House leadership, so it's both Republican and Democrats. And if you look at the composition of the commission itself, it's pretty well balanced between Republican and Democrats. The commission was written for the next administration, not knowing if it was going to be Democratic or Republican. The election was on November 8th. we pretty much went to press at the end of November for all intents and purposes. And so what we tried to do in all of our recommendations, but it's particularly important with the government, is lay out a strategic plan for how what are the important elements that government should be paying attention to in a proposed structure, with enough flexibility so that whichever administration came in and however it chose to be organized and whoever was leading it would be able to take a look at these to guide, even if some of those structures are going to change. I think what's important to be aware of is any administration could come in and determine that that role of assistant might not be the one that he wanted, and looking at how to create the most effective structure for this issue.
Which raises the kind of question of what kind of response this has already had and is going to have. And the report is hot off the press, so not that many people had a chance to read it all the way through. Mm-hmm. But to the extent that people have responded to it, I think people feel that it accurately reflects the kind of the issues that are out there and proposes some way forwards. To the extent that there's been criticism of it, it's been particularly around the fact that this report, we don't really know what the new administration is going to do, mm-hmm. May not have as much purchase with them as it might have had with a Democratic administration, and that it potentially is not as sort of forward-looking as some people would have liked. How do you respond to that? Sure. And secondly, what are the things that you think that if the new administration is going to just focus on one or two recommendations, which ones would you direct them to?
So I think to the first question about, not sure how this will fare with the next administration, I think any new administration that was coming in with a president-elect with whom the city, D.C., didn't have familiarity with, they would say that. And so I would push back on that pretty hard, because I don't actually think, this is on the issues, and I think everything, when we look at a new administration, they're looking to understand the issues, and so the hope is that this is a pretty strong roadmap for doing so. What was your second question?
The second one was if this new administration is going to have even more than
right,
most to get its head around as it arrives into office, which are the ones that you think you really need to focus on those? Mm-hmm. And I'll ask the same question for Tim, actually. From a governor's perspective, which do you think are the ones that you would like the Trump administration to focus on?
So I think most importantly is the importance of cybersecurity. We felt strongly about this with either administration, that the president-elect needs to come in and say to his cabinet and to his senior officials, this is a key issue for which you are all responsible. I think one of the obvious changes from 8 years ago to today is that this is not an IT issue. It's not siloed in a department somewhere. That senior officials, and we've seen the effects of when it's failed and when it's succeeded, that senior officials in this government are responsible for the cybersecurity of their agencies. Cybersecurity is not a tangential issue that you're trying to reconcile other resources with. It's critical to the core mission of every agency, regardless of what the agency does. And that education and that information up front is key to what this next administration needs to be looking at. I would also take a look at the role of technology as a key issue for how we're looking at policy. Because to your point, it's about human behavior, but looking at a technology focus within the executive office of the president. Because oftentimes, right now, when we're looking at the future of IoT and connected devices, this is where we're going to see a lot of challenges and a lot of vulnerabilities. And that is critical to looking at how we structure and make resilient our government infrastructure as well as our private sector. And so I would say, clearly it's making this a priority. It's organizing around that. It's ensuring that what we're doing in government allows for innovation and does not get caught up in legacy. And we go into some specific recommendations on that. But then truly appreciating and understanding that technology is not about the next new cool thing in Silicon Valley. This is a key to how our infrastructure is evolving and how the interconnectedness of the physical and cyber is creating interdependencies that are only going to proliferate.
Tim, which bits of the report do you think Governor Corliff and his colleagues would want the administration to focus on?
Sure, I would agree with a lot of what Kiersten said, but I would also add to that the whole of government approach. I think that's one of the things, I know that's one of the things that the governors are keen on, is that cybersecurity cannot just be managed from Washington or from Trenton or from Albany or from Sacramento. It has to be managed in every city and every state capital and in Washington, D.C. It's a joint whole of government approach that must bring together industry, academia, state, local, and the federal government. So I really was happy to see the report. I know they did a lot of outreach with state and local officials. I think the importance of the report is that it raises this topic at a key time. As the new administration's coming in, making decisions about what to focus on, raising the specter of cybersecurity, elevating the importance around the issue, how you have to organize for it. Not only do you have to have the right people in place, they have to have the right authorities, they have to have the right responsibilities, has to be enumerated in a way that makes sense, and that when the next OPM does happen and the president does turn to his cybersecurity advisor, that person understands the threat but also could have had the ability to change what could have happened before and has the capability to respond. So I think elevating this issue and also promoting the fact that it's not just a federal government Washington, D.C. issue.
Thank you. I have loads more questions, and I could sit here and ask them for a long time, but I'm conscious there are other people in the room who will also have questions. So we have about sort of 10, 15 minutes left. If anyone has a question they would like to ask, please raise your hand. We'll group a few questions in order to get as many in as possible. So we'll take 1, 2, 3. We'll ask the questions first, and then we'll pass them on to Kiersten and Tim. And if you could give your name and affiliation.
Joe Marks from NextGov. Thanks for doing this. 2 quick related things. One, has the Trump administration reached out to you at all in any form yet? And do you know if they've looked at the report? And then second, a couple of days before Thanksgiving, the president-elect released a video with a few priorities, one of which was a full review of what he called vital infrastructure for cyber vulnerabilities, led by DoD and the Joint Chiefs, which would seem to be a shift from DHS being the lead civilian agency. Do you have reactions or thoughts about that?
Okay, and I think we had one on this end and one in the front. The importance of the microphone is this is being live streamed, so no one hear your question unless you have.
Thanks. Tim Rideout from the German Marshall Fund. I'm wondering if, in explaining to the next administration sort of the lessons learned, and I'm thinking about a really interesting paper that Cam Carey did over at Brookings, sort of explaining the cyber internet working group and digital. Conceptually, do you think there's still a need? Because in my own work, I've sort of discovered that there's still a gap in understanding between sort of how outer space fits into this. The ride-sharing business model to me is the best example because GPS is not the internet, but obviously Uber and all those other things depend on the internet. Is there going to be an effort to explain, like, okay, what's the conceptual differences between these types of networks, so you can think about them and not say, oh, it's just cyber, it's just the internet. It's a constellation of things, and do you see a need to explain that to the next administration?
And right at the front, hangs up.
Hi, this is Rick Weber at Insight Cybersecurity. For Kiersten, this is a consensus document. It's presented sort of as a consensus document. What were some of those issues that the commissioners could not agree on that you chose to leave out? And for Tim, the section on the National Guard, I mean, it's interesting in that, National Guard's already doing quite a bit. So what does this report allow you or would prompt the Governors Association to start doing differently?
So we'll start with Tim, but I would also say in the final panel today, we're going to dig into some of those sort of National Guard issues with Tim. But Tim, and then I'll allow Kiersten to pick up all of the other points.
Sure. So on the Guard, you're correct that the governors are using the Guard to varying degrees across the country. If you look at one state, you've seen exactly one state. I would suggest there's probably 56 different models for how the Guard is being used. So I was happy to see the fact that the Guard was elevated in the report and called out as an important asset. I think the recommendation specifically addresses governors seeking state legislation to discern how they can utilize the Guard. So that's one thing that we're focused on. We're actually currently working on drafting a paper on how governors can use the National Guard, and hopefully that'll be out in the next month or so. And that's one area of it, but also working with DoD to clarify when and how the Guard can be used, under what status, who pays for it, all the different rules. I think one of the feedback we've heard from some states is they want to use the Guard, they're interested in using the Guard, it's a critical asset, but they just want to make sure that they're using the Guard in the idealized and perfect manner, the way that the DoD and that the military sees it being used. So that's why I was happy to see it in there.
Kiersten, you have a lot to chew on, but we have Trump reach out and possible sort of focus refocus towards DoD, sort of wider considerations of how the internet is used, and what's not in the document in terms of what commissioners would like to have seen.
The cutting room floor.
And I could add to that, I know you've spoken to the President about this, but what kind of reaction are you getting from President Obama to the report that he commissioned?
That's an interesting piece. So this is an independent commission that was called for by the President with a bipartisan, nonpartisan nature. Regarding the Trump administration, we were obviously under the rules that we all became familiar with, particularly with some recent news. The sequence of this had to be that we had to present to the president through official channels. So the report was released it was submitted on December 1st, as was required by the executive order. And then the chair and I met with the president on Friday and briefed him on the report. And at that point, because of those channels, the next step now is for the current administration to reach out to the president-elect, to the Trump administration, to help set up the briefings, which it all seems to be the sequence that everybody's following. But there just obviously are appropriate channels to follow. So that sequence should be happening. Regarding the civilian agency, it'll be interesting. I think it's a thoughtful approach that they looked at DoD and the joint staffs. I don't think that necessarily means they're not paying attention to the civilian agencies, but having not spoken to them, I don't know all of that, but I do think it's important that all of these entities are engaged. And so I actually see this reaching out in different forms, those that we may not think are typical or what the logical step would be, as a good sign of thinking creatively around, okay, is there a hybrid here? But I don't think in any way that it means that DHS or the civilian agencies are taking a back seat at this point. Regarding the cyber networks, we do have a recommendation in here about GPS and looking at some of the broader issues. And so that is clearly something that hopefully when given the opportunity to brief the new administration, there is the realm. Because obviously the report is the report, but the opportunity to brief would allow for greater context around why these recommendations were chosen, what was put in, what wasn't, and why. And so that's clearly a key point of understanding the infrastructure. The cutting room floor question, the consensus document, it is a consensus document. I want to take the time, because this is something that the chair has said publicly as well. This was truly an extraordinary group of individuals. There were 12 commissioners, and absolutely every single one of them were invested from day one and contributed to this. I think sometimes to the surprise of people when we would say, each one of them took a pen, and this is truly a report that's written by the commission. And so there was, I think, so to Rick's question, because that's the process, nothing truly gets eliminated. There is always this intent on reaching reconciled and compromised language. But what is, I think, a true feat in this is that compromised language doesn't lead to boiled down language. And where the commission was very emphatic throughout this is we're not going to put forth recommendations that say, this should be studied further, or establish this in a way that was always broad, is being strategic enough, as I said earlier, so that it can be interpreted by a broad range of audiences, but where appropriate, being specific. And so, I'll just say that one of the interesting discussions that might be of interest to this group, to Rick's point, but it didn't lead to anything not getting included, was where power and authority for how government manages cybersecurity should exist. And looking at, does it exist solely within the executive office of the president? Does it exist with each individual agency? And so what you'll see in here, and I think it's probably why we go into a lot of detail, is a very specific approach that allows for each of those elements to get addressed, and to effectively look at cyber. So to be truly honest, I don't believe, I will think about this question a little bit more specifically, Rick, and I'll come back to you if I think of something really big, but there was nothing that somebody said we need to be talking about this, and then it got discarded. And that, I believe, was a function of the fact that these 12 individuals were negotiating and really talking through each of these recommendations, and everybody knew what was important to the other. And so even in some cases, you may see things that sort of feel like they're a little bit tangential, but it was because it was important to a group of commissioners to include this in this document.
there are clearly many more questions we could ask, but I want to take my opportunity as the moderator to last the ask question for this panel, and that's around what happens next. So I guess for Tim, it's kind of what are you going to be doing in the course of 2017, leveraging this report and looking at sort of how the states sort of take this agenda forward. And Kiersten, specifically on the sort of work of the Commission and the life of the report, as we go into a new administration, what happens next? Does this continue to be something that does the Commission just disappear and this report sits on the shelf, or are you going to advocate for it and work to get some of the things implemented? Tim.
Sure. So the focus of our work in 2017 is going to be to continue to build on our past successes in providing governors the resources that they need to prepare their states to protect the information that they hold, to defend critical networks that the state owns, but also to work with critical infrastructure owners and operators to be ready for when their networks are compromised. Additionally, one of the issues that brought up was workforce. That's an issue that is continually on the minds of all the states that we work with. How do we grow and preserve our state workforce to protect those networks, but also how do we develop the workforce of the future so that it's not just around cybersecurity jobs, it's around the larger technology ecosystem. How do we make sure we've got education systems and workforce pipelines that are designed to produce workers that are in demand? So the focus of our work will be to continue to help governors think around how they're organized to meet the cybersecurity threat as it stands today, but also how are they prepared to meet the technology challenges and also opportunities of the future.
I think, from day one, the commissioners felt that December 1st was not the end line, the finish line, it was the starting line, and that this was, all the phrases that were used, this was not a victory lap tour for the Obama administration, this was not about everything that had been done well, it was very much about looking into the future. And so now the commission is thinking through how do we execute on these. One of the things that I believe will happen, and I think will be one of the elements about which the commission should be most proud, is that some of these recommendations, particularly those that are looking at industry, will be executed by the commissioners in their own entities, in their own businesses when you look at workforce. And that, to me, that's the true kind of put your money where your mouth is, because it is saying not only did we propose this, but we believe in it, that we're going to be executing it. And this is meant to be a very actionable document. So we're in the process right now of looking at what the next probably 4 to 6 weeks look at and getting the information out about this. But then what is the next step? If you look at the 9/11 Commission, there was the Public Discourse Project, which was an effort. So I don't think that something along those lines will be as specific to this report, but I'm not sure. And a lot of people have said, well, what comes next with all of this? And the commission was so focused on getting to December 1st that what we've had over the weekend and now over the next week or two will be to think about what does come next and how to make sure that these are executed, because these in a report do nothing. That they have to be executed out in the real world. And I think the first step is hopefully having the opportunity to be able to brief the Trump administration. Just one quick point is when President Obama came in, there was no real background on cyber, and they had the 60-day, I don't think it was the sprint, it was called the sprint, but it was 60 days to get up a cyber strategy and all this. So President Obama has done the next administration a great favor by bringing together some of the best and brightest minds for 8 months to look at cybersecurity and to put together a roadmap. So the hope is that this can be a starting place, so this lag time is minimized as much as possible, and that the new administration can take this and hit the ground running as quickly as possible.
Thank you both very much. Kiersten, as we've discussed in the past, we at New America are very keen to be part of that ongoing discourse and providing our platform to sort of taking it forward. But we're going to sort of start that with the next 3 panels, sort of digging into in a bit more detail education, workforce, sort of the role of the regulators at the state level and then the states themselves. So if I could ask you to show our appreciation and invite Emma and the next panel to take their seats. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, we're going to keep it rolling. You can grab your coffee and have a seat. Okay, thanks for joining us, sticking around. We are going to now turn to cybersecurity education, and we have a tight schedule, so I'm going to keep the introductions brief. Right on my right, we have Frank Zaborowski, who is with the Air Force Association Cyber Patriot Program. He is the Director of Cyber Patriot Operations. And next to him is Kevin Carey, who is the Director of the Education Policy Program here at New America. And finally, Davina Pruitt-Mental, who is the lead for academic engagement at NICE, the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education. So I'll offer a little bit of framing, and then we'll have a conversation up here for 25, 30 minutes, and then we'll come to the audience for questions. I want to read two quotes briefly from the commission report that I think highlight two threads of the question that we're going to dig into. The first one is, effective cybersecurity depends on consumer and workforce awareness, education, and engagement in protecting their digital experience. This effort must be a continuous process and advance individuals' understanding and capabilities as vital participants in shaping their own and the nation's cybersecurity. And then on the other hand, we have cybersecurity offers a premium in pay over other fields in information technology, yet a sizable gap between open positions and qualified applicants has persisted for almost a decade. Both the quantity and quality of those applying for positions remain significant problems, as does the challenge of ensuring training is up to date and effective. It goes on to say the workforce shortage in cybersecurity is directly related to a larger problem. Too few high school and college students in the United States are developing the necessary skills for careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So on the one hand, we have a mandate that cybersecuring the nation requires a population that is generally more cyber aware. And on the other hand, we have a mandate that in order to fill the workforce gap, we specifically need to equip populations with the skills necessary to do so. Those strands need not be in tension, but I want to dig in a little bit more later on as we talk about what the priorities are for cybersecurity education. So, Davina, can you kick us off and tell us why, although the federal government is important in this space, this is really a state and local issue?
Okay, so the short answer for that would be because that's the way our educational system works, that it is controlled, at least the K-12, by the state and local. I think you were hoping for a little bit more than that, though, so I will mention. So NICE, the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, which is led by NIST, part of the Department of Commerce, it's been around for a while since the cyberspace policy report in 2009, and then it reaffirmed the role of NICE with the Cybersecurity Enhancement Act in 2014. And the role there is to come up with a strategic plan for developing cybersecurity workforce. And so the mission is to promote a robust network and ecosystem of cybersecurity education, training, and workforce development. With that in mind, we like to think of ourselves as a convening body that stitches all the different pieces of the quilt that are activities that are going on. So to answer your question, there are many federal activities in place, as well as various state and local that are taking place, and we try to organize so that we're moving strategically in one direction. So, for example, it was mentioned in the commission that NSA has their Gen Cyber camps, so that's a federal effort. OSTP has their Computer Science for All initiative that's going on, that's kind of focusing on computer science and trying to weave in cybersecurity. You have various other federal initiatives. You have the 2- and 4-year institutions that are designated by DHS and NSA as centers of academic excellence. And at the same time, you have state and local, which are really the ones that put forth the efforts to get students and collegiate folks engaged in this workforce. And so they're starting to develop curriculum or content to go in interdisciplinary across the K-12. You have activities starting to crop up in terms of CTE programs, career technical education pathway programs. But all of them are going in different directions, and so we want to try to make sure that we're at least all aligning one to the NICE workforce framework, so the different 7 categories and the 32 specialty areas in cybersecurity, that they're also all aligning to feed into those centers of academic excellence in our 2- and 4-year institutions. So again, just a real brief example, there are various computer science activities going on. And so you have Project Lead the Way. How many are familiar with Project Lead the Way? A few? Okay. It's in most of the high schools and middle schools throughout the U.S. It's more of the sweet spot is engineering. So they wanted to get into cybersecurity too, develop some content. They don't want to go down the path of computer science because there's a gazillion things going on in that domain. So they started to develop it based on like pen testing, Network Plus, Linux, Security Plus, that type of thing. And the question was, why? If your sweet spot is engineering, look at, instead of the operate and maintain or the detect and defend, look at the securely provision category of the NICE workforce framework, because that gives our students another option, another pathway that they might want to pursue instead of just being kind of niched into an area. So our role in the federal, with the NICE initiative, is to try to holistically bring everyone together to move forward.
Thanks for that. Frank, Davina told us about some partnership that she sees and oversees. Can you tell us a bit more about the role of organizations in this space? What are you seeing that's working and why?
I'm Frank Zaborowski with the Air Force Association, and one of the things that we take a look at when we look at cyber is a national security issue, and that's the technical workforce shortage, and also protecting our cyberspace from actors, whether they're criminal or foreign. One of the things that we focus on are the soft skills. So, for instance, an iPhone. There's no class in school that shows you how to use an iPhone, but I guarantee you that probably every 6th grader knows how to use an iPhone who's had any access to one, even people in disadvantaged communities, because a lot of people have these. So it's soft skills that are learned. So through the competition space that we use within the Cyber Patriot program, what we're trying to do is from middle school and high school is to motivate students to go into careers and education in cybersecurity. Now, with that said, not everybody's going to go to college. And one of the things that we're trying to really work with our sponsors on, and Northrop Grumman, one of our bigger sponsors, has done, is create internships. For instance, how would you like to be a kid with a B average, some computer science classes in school, and if you can get a secret clearance, you can work for Northrop Grumman for a summer job, $12 to $15 an hour at one of the 8 facilities in the United States. So that starts motivating students to want to go into this line of work. Another thing is we're looking below the middle school, not so much for a competition space, but also for an education space, because when we spoke with educators, Department of Education, and other people, what they tell us, if a student is not interested in science, engineering, technology, or even math, by the time they're in 5th and 6th grade, they're probably not going to be a late bloomer. They may be, but they're probably not. So what we're trying to do is motivate students in the lower levels to learn a little bit more about cybersecurity, and then move into the competition space. Now, to get to your question about organizations, what they can do, it's just like Little League Baseball. You know, you don't have a baseball program in elementary school. Where does everybody learn how to play baseball? In Little League. Or soccer, or any of those types of things. So we feel that by approaching it from the soft side, after-school activities, is that we can make a difference. And it's not just Cyber Patriot. It could be any competition. It could be any type of club that you would have set up. But it's trying to get people into the mindset that cybersecurity is important, and then by virtue of that is getting them to move into the workforce to make up for these jobs that Davina talked about that just are not being filled. The other thing that we emphasize in our program, and I know CyberWatch and a lot of the other ones emphasize, are ethics. What we do not want to have happen is have an 18 or 19-year-old end up in federal prison at 19 or 18 because they hacked a bank. Okay, we do not want that to happen. What we focus on is cyber defense. Now, there's a lot of other entities that focus on ethical hacking. They focus on capture the flag and different things like that, which have their place, and we understand that. But what we're trying to do is create a nation where people are good cyber citizens. And you know, it's done voluntarily. You can't force somebody to be a good cyber citizen. It's something that they pick up and they learn. So with those two things, trying to interest people in the workforce, also trying to have an ethical understanding and awareness of cybersecurity, we think we can make a difference. And I got to tell you, we've run post-competition surveys for people who have been in our program for 4 years. And again, I'm not taking this as, hey, Cyber Patriot's the end-all. But what I'm saying is that the students who come into Cyber Patriot, a lot of them are not on track to be gifted and talented, you know, advanced placement. A lot of them are just regular kids. And nobody told them about cybersecurity. It's just a club at the school. They got interested in it. And when we look at our exit surveys for the kids who are coming out of high school, what we're finding is most of them, and I'm talking 77% and higher, either get a job or they go into post-secondary education in a science, technology, or engineering field, and many of them into cybersecurity. So that's the soft side of it. We applaud the work that NICE is doing and the other government entities with trying to get it formalized, but really we feel that this is a competition. It's an education program. It's supposed to excite kids just like that Little League or soccer league that they could participate in elementary school and work their way through high school. That's it.
Before I move to Kevin, since you mentioned them, could you briefly tell us, for those who don't know, what a cybersecurity competition looks like?
Well, cybersecurity competition, in our regards, there's different types. In our regards, what happens is for this year we had 4,000 teams across the United States. They're 4 to 6 students each. And a week before one of our online competitions, we allow them to download a virtual operating system. So something like Windows 7. They download it, but what they don't know is how we sabotaged it. So we're not getting into having activity going up against them, but we've taken all the passwords out. We've taken any security feature that Microsoft has in Windows 7. So if a student puts an antivirus on that operating system, they get a point. If they put a password on it and lock it down, they get a point. If they lock it down too much where you can't use your email, they lose points. And it gets more and more difficult. We have backdoors and things like that as the competition rolls on. But it's done in 4 online rounds once a month. We run it on Friday through Sunday. It's 6 hours, but it's 6 hours that the team picks, and it's continuous. And then at the end, we have the students who do well, the top 28 teams across the country, through the generosity of our sponsors. We can fly them or have them transported to Baltimore, and all expenses paid, and they go up against a red team where they're actually using these cyber defense skills to go against penetration testers that we have available from our sponsors.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Kevin, the challenge of cybersecurity education isn't arriving on a blank slate. It's not happening in a vacuum. Can you tell us how you see this issue interacting with, in the broader educational ecosystem, the challenges and trends that already exist there?
Sure. I think, as was mentioned earlier, it's always a challenge to implement any kind of educational idea nationwide just because of the sort of basic decentralized model of how our education system is designed. So, you know, we have 92% of all the funding for K through 12 education in the United States comes from state and local governments, about equally mixed between local property taxes and state funding. The 8% that comes from the federal government is overwhelmingly targeted toward specific vulnerable student populations, mostly students who live in low-income communities and students with disabilities. The omnibus Federal Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was just reauthorized by Congress late last year, actually prohibits the Secretary of Education from in any way directing curriculum in local schools. He or she can't tell teachers what to teach in any way or capacity. That's actually sort of a somewhat elaborate set of prohibitions to that effect, which reflects the political feeling among members of Congress that education ought to be controlled at the state and local level and ought not be directed nationally. So it sounded from the earlier conversation, and again, I know a fair amount about education and very little about cybersecurity. I think that's my role here. That the commission was talking both about education for citizenship, but also education for the workforce. And so, those I think are related, but also like fairly distinct challenges. If we're talking about education for citizenship in particular, and we really do want to talk about getting into the curriculum so that an elementary school child, for example, interacting with an iPad would start to learn about cybersecurity. I have a child in elementary school. I'm sure she has not been so educated. Now I feel just one more thing that I've not done as a parent. I'm letting her play with my phone all the time. At the minimum, you would have to work with people at the state level and probably at the local level, because even at the state level, states only really adopt academic standards, and they could adopt standards around cybersecurity if they wanted to. But all the curricular decisions are made by individual school districts, and there are roughly 13,000 individual school districts in the United States of America. Obviously, some bigger than others. Over 1 million students in New York City. Some school districts only serve a handful of students. It does strike me there are a couple of opportunities, however. Parents and people are always very interested in technology generally, right? And I think the idea of training people, providing technological literacy to young children is an attractive idea, something that people just think is kind of cool and kind of modern. So I do think people will be open to that idea. And it's also, it should note that technology adoption is actually very decentralized in our schools. So here's what I mean by that. Curriculum is a policy issue that happens at various levels. The technology itself that people use is actually often made by individual teachers. So, for example, I have a daughter in first grade, and her teacher uses a somewhat elaborate system of like thumbs up, thumbs down for behavior. So you sit quietly, you get a thumbs up. My daughter's very bad at that. And then she marks it on her computer, and it shows up in an app that I have on my phone. So when my daughter pick up my daughter up from school, I can open up my phone and say, I see you got three thumbs up and 2 thumbs down. She doesn't like that. But the point being, that's a decision the teacher made by herself. She just decided to implement this technology in her classroom and tell all the students and the parents to use it. That wasn't even anything that like her principal told her to use. That was just the teacher. And in fact, a lot of technology adoption in our K through 12 schools is at the individual teacher level. And there are like tens of thousands of teachers using this one particular program. And so working actually directly with the people who are providing technological tools to individual teachers could be a way to have adoption at scale and not deal with the bureaucracy of governments. So there's that. If we're talking about workforce part of it and making sure that we have a trained workforce, then we get more into the post-secondary level. And again, there are a set of challenges to address. One of the kind of oddities of our higher education system is that there's essentially an inverse relationship between the amount of prestige and the amount of resources that we bestow to institutions of higher education and the extent to which they are labor market oriented. So our very prestigious research universities, which is where we send all of the best and brightest in a very, very efficient system of sorting. We're actually very good at kind of sorting for social capital and cognitive capital and training and all the rest of it, and kind of getting all those students together in one places. Those are the places that actually care the least about the labor market. They're very academically oriented. They're very prestige oriented. If you came to them and said, the nation has a pressing need for X more people who can do this, they just don't care. That's not their job to care about that. And then on the sort of flip end of the market, where you have institutions that have the least resources, that are charged most with serving a broad kind of and diverse group of students, they actually tend to be more labor market oriented, but sometimes to a fault, right? So if you're to get on our metro system here in Washington, D.C., or go on the subway in New York, you won't see the advertisements for cybersecurity programs from the prestige research universities. You'll see it from for-profit colleges. Or nonprofit colleges that essentially are in a workforce orientation. Some of which can be very good and be very market responsive. Some of which are not so good and can be overly expensive. And it is a very badly regulated part of our education system. There's not really much in the way of watchdog organizations that help consumers sort out the good cybersecurity program from the one that will just kind of induce you to take out a lot of student loans and then not really give you something where there's a lot of labor market value. But there is a lot of work to be done there. I noticed, I was happy to note in the recommendations a call for working on apprentice-focused programs. We actually, our Center for Education and Skills here at New America is very focused on expanding the idea of apprenticeship as a model for people who aren't going to get a bachelor's degree to kind of have a pathway toward a high-paying job. Traditionally, that's been limited to the trades, kind of traditionally more blue-collar, frankly, more white male jobs. We think the model actually can be expanded to lots of different areas, and this could definitely be one of them.
Wonderful. Davina, in many policy areas, the private sector plays a key role, particularly, perhaps more so here. Can you talk a bit about the role of industry in the cybersecurity education challenge? Where are incentives aligned, and where aren't they, and what are you seeing?
Okay. And before I forget, I wanted to just say that there is some good news with at least the cybersecurity awareness domain. So within the educational system, a lot, at least with I think it's with the public and private, a lot of the E-rate funding is attached to, one of the requirements is sort of internet safety. And along with that, schools have adopted either in full or they have redone the standards, and those are called the ISTE standards, International Society for Educational Technology. They have digital literacy standards. And so within that, you do see components of cybersecurity. And there are a plethora of other standards that actually do address more of the awareness piece. And we could do maybe a better job in teaching that, but at least those standards are in place. Where we do fall a little short is with the cybersecurity career awareness or the workforce skills. So to that end, and bridging it to your question with industry, I think industry has a critical role in sharing with us what are their particular needs. And are there certifications? Are there, what are the roles and the skills, and are the NICE workforce framework was built with those industry input, as well as with the interagency groups, their feedback. And actually that workforce framework is up for a special publication at NIST, and it's open for public comment until January 6th. So if you would like to take a look at that and make comments on it. So their perspective, I think, is extremely important because they're the ones that are hiring. We want to know whether they be soft skills, as was mentioned earlier, whether they be in particular areas in the that's mapped to the NICE workforce framework, whether they need a bachelor's or a master's or a PhD level or just certification straight out of high school. All of those, that input is really valuable.
Some of the branding that gets used to hook kids uses language, rhetoric like cyber ninja, cyber warrior, and there are some concerns that rhetoric is not broadly appealing to various populations of kids that we need to be interested. So how do you balance the genuine desire to appeal to kids as quickly as possible to enter this space with the broader desire to make sure you're using language that in a sustainable way gets all kinds of kids interested? Anyone have thoughts on that?
I have a few thoughts on it. One of the things that we did at Cyber Patriot was determined, along with our sponsors, that there are few females within the workforce, and what we want to do is increase the number of females that at least were interested in going to careers in education. One of the things we did is we toned down our materials. If you look at our materials, we have faces on there that are more than just male faces. We allow all female teams to participate for free. It's only $195 for a whole team to participate in our competition. So we took that on as wanting to make it an environment where it's attractive to young women. But then on the other hand, when you're talking about cyber ninjas, cyber warriors, those sorts of things, one of the things that we wanted to do was maintain that we're into cyber defense, and that this is more of an ethical kind of competition and space that we're in. And if we had to name it something other than Cyber Patriot today, we probably would, but that's our name, and we're sticking with it.
Anyone else want to take a crack at that? Nope.
No, I can add to that. I can say one of the things that has been very fruitful is understanding that there's a broader range of career options in cybersecurity than just one little peg. So what we have found, and there we have a great collegiate as well as a K-12 nice working group and subgroups within that, and increasing the number of women and minorities is one of the issues, and to diversify. And you're finding more and more women in cybersecurity organizations popping up as well that are really tackling this issue. So some of the things that we find are that more of the women gravitate to like systems engineering, more of the management area, law and digital forensics is another component. So if you can develop programs that are around that, sort of the ethical and societal need, they are more geared towards that. The K-12 working group was very instrumental in really pushing out to our 2- and 4-year institutions, as well as a lot of the nonprofits that do a lot of outreach to the K-12 entity to say, hey, there's a lot of research already been done in working in this particular area for trying to attract girls into other technology fields, computer science, engineering. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. Build on what they have already done and try to take it to the next level, applying it to this particular field. So I think that's something that is useful.
I have one more for Kevin, and then we'll open it up to the audience, so please prepare your questions. Kevin, you talked about the challenge of changing curricula, and you said you just got to go to the state, to the local area. Can you walk us through what that actually looks like? It doesn't have to be from a cybersecurity point of view. For if I say I think these things need to be on the curriculum, who am I going to? Who has the power in that situation?
I mean, I would, for something as narrow as cybersecurity, which I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, it's a big wide world. There's a lot of different issues out there. It's unlikely that a state is going to adopt sort of or make an addition to a broad curriculum framework around something that's specific. Curriculum frameworks cover the basics: math, language arts, history, social studies, science. Things like different, maybe kind of different areas of science. So I think your best bet is to actually probably less the state level than the local level. I mean, you think about some of the big districts here in Washington, D.C. It's easier in the states that have large school districts. Candidly, I mean, which is again a strange and kind of idiosyncratic way that American education is organized. States like Illinois and Texas have hundreds of school districts. States like Florida and Maryland just have a handful because they have large counties and they organize their districts that way. But if you were talking to just the Montgomery County public school system, you would be talking to people who have reach over a large and diverse group of students. So probably large districts are the best bet. And then talking to the people who have some purchase over science and technology and mathematics in that. And I would make a sort of a related point, but to kind of go along with what some of the other respondents have been saying. It's hard ultimately to, through the education system, put a strong thumb on the scale in terms of what kind of career people choose. There's lots of careers out there, and even if you're the kind of person who's inclined to do this, there's probably like lots of choices other than being in cybersecurity. It's really just like a broad supply issue, and the bottom line is there really aren't a lot of second chances in our education system when it comes to STEM careers. If you're not more or less on track in mathematics by the 8th grade, your chances of actually having a valuable credential in a STEM career are essentially zero. Like just think of them as being zero. You could probably find someone out there that found their way back into the field, but it's such a small number as to be insignificant. So if we've lost them by age 12, we've lost them forever for the purposes of this conversation. We can put lots of great training programs in at the community college level or at the high school level, and we can work with the boot camps and do all that stuff, but we'll be working with maybe 30 or 40% of the overall population at that point. We've probably already lost most of the students there. So in some ways, just providing support to the broader effort to improve the mathematics and science education in the elementary and middle school grades will just from a sheer number standpoint give you a larger labor force to work with, and then try to kind of find some of those people to go into this field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go for it.
Oh, one of the things to piggyback on that is that I grew up in the 1960s. It was an elementary school, and I'm a victim of new math. And new math was supposed to be teaching kids how to be scientists by the time that they were school, so we could catch up, or high school by time, so we could catch up with the Russians in the space program. So we all know how that worked. By 70s, everybody said we were stupid, and they say the current generation's stupid, and so on and so forth. But one of the things that I like about the organizational aspect of this is what you said, is motivating people toward these careers. It's not like Europe. Once you're put into a track, you stay in that track. This is freedom. We have freedom of choice within the nation. Just to give you a short anecdote, we had, some of these make your eyes water, but I'll just tell you one, is that we have a student had a student in San Antonio, Texas, who, he didn't know his father. His mother was a drug addict. He was raised between relatives and all that, and he was going down the wrong path. So he got involved. It was in particular with our organization, with our competition. It could be anybody's, and he found that he liked it. And he did so much that he went and got himself a certification, wasn't going to college, and he walked into a $40,000 a year job when he graduated from high school. And what I think that we all need to take a look at in this room is that when I grew up in Pittsburgh in the 60s and 70s, if you were a steel worker, you had a high school diploma, and plus you had a middle-class lifestyle. You could afford a new car every 5 years. You could pay your mortgage on your house. Your kids could go to college. That is what cyber education and technology is doing today. And I think with not only the academic curriculum we're talking about, but with organizations and also with parents and all the things that go with the social makeup of our society, I think that we can motivate people to have those middle-class jobs that everybody is seeking. And this is one of those things that are standing out there, and I think a lot of times we fail to address the amount of money that the students can make if they do go into these fields, even if they don't go to college. So.
Can I just add to that very, very quickly? Absolutely agree with that. I think we also need to put in perspective, too, that and there's some great studies out there. The STEM report is one of them. It's a couple years old now, but from Georgetown Economic Workforce Development that looks at, we can get these students really excited going into any of the STEM careers. And I'm all for that, all for getting, summer camps, after-school programs, get CTE pathway programs, the whole 9 yards. But where we need to also focus is we can get them in there in that freshman, sophomore year, they drop out. Or they switch and from a STEM degree program into something else. So that's another area we need to figure out what's going on. Because we can excite everyone we want, but if we don't keep them in there to complete it, or for some reason they're getting in and then they're leaving and going into another discipline, something's happening there that we need to take a little stronger peek at as well.
Thanks. We have time for a few questions. Please identify yourself and your question with a question mark, and I can take them all at once. Any questions? One over here. Oh, just wait for the mic, sir, please. It's right behind you.
Hi, Girish Seshagiri with HP Information Technologies. We're a defense contractor providing cybersecurity services to the Department of Defense. One of the things we didn't talk about here, or the earlier panel, was the role of employers in these educational aspects of cybersecurity. And one of the issues that I think we have is this skills gap. We do have a lot of cybersecurity jobs that are open. We can't fill them because we don't have people with the skills. But at the same time, we have not been involved in the educational aspect of what they should have. So a pilot that I did in Peoria, Illinois, which I think is successful, is a 2-year associate degree in secure software development. And it came from Carnegie Mellon University, funded by Homeland Security for a 4-year degree. We created a 2-year version of it. But we're still having difficulty, I'm having difficulty scaling it up nationally, because I think this is a very important thing we can do, but employers are not quite coming up to doing that, where they're getting involved in the educational system. You have any recommendations for that, any of you?
I mean, this is a broad problem in the interaction between education and the workforce. Employers are very good at articulating the shortcomings of the people who come out of the education system. They're not as good at actually providing advice and engagement and support and resources on a sustained level. So there's a lot of work to be done there. I think you have to think about technology as a vehicle for scale in education. So it used to be we would have to go community college by community college by community college if we were going to kind of implement these programs. But a lot of programs are now online. There are a lot of good online programs. We had a panel here a couple months ago where we had the dean of the computer science department at Georgia Tech University, which has created a very low-cost online 1-year master's degree program in computer science. Now, because Georgia Tech is like a top 10 computer science department, they're teaching AI theory and stuff like that. I mean, because that's what they think is interesting. That's why they're a top 10. They're not really teaching the nitty-gritty, but the model is there. I mean, they've got, it's an inexpensive program. They've got it worked out about how to engage with students online. It is not a low-quality online program. It is a high-quality online program where you can create a reasonably high-touch supportive model where students can actually engage with other students, can engage with mentors. They're not just kind of left to their own devices, but keep the cost at an affordable level, where what we're trying to go after is a labor market that includes mid-career professionals, includes non-traditional college students, people who are trying to make a job transition, which means they don't want to spend $50,000, but maybe they'll spend 10. I think that's a scale opportunity that probably is where there's a lot of room for growth.
Wonderful. I know we have one more question, but I am noticing that we are out of time. So join me in thanking our panelists and welcoming the next panel. And Rob. Next up, we'll have Rob moderating a panel on regulation and legislation.
Thank you. Conversational. They are, technically.
I think we'll give you guys and gals in the back about a minute to pick up some food and then return to your seats. All right, so as folks are finishing up in the back there, I think I'll get started with the introductions. But first, I'd like to say thank you, one and all, for coming this morning and watching on the live stream if you are. My name's Rob Morgus. I am a policy analyst here at New America with the Cybersecurity Initiative. And I'm joined today by an outstanding panel of folks. I'm going to start at the far end there with Evan Wolf, who's the a partner and co-chair of Crowell & Mooring's Privacy and Cybersecurity Group. He also was one of the initial DHS employees, we'll go with that, and is just generally a lawyer who understands how technology works. Next to him is Heather Hogsett. She's the VP of Technology and Risk Strategy at BITS, and previously was at the NGA focusing on cybersecurity, amongst other things. And right next to me is David Mussington, who's currently a professor of practice at University of Maryland, but in the past he's held a number of government roles, including in the DoD. We'll kick things off with you, Evan. Can you start us off by giving us a sort of 30,000-foot view of regulation, legislation at the state level? How does it differ from, complement, and oftentimes complicate federal efforts in the same front?
Sure.
And is there a sweet spot for states?
Every spot for states is a sweet spot, I guess, but I'll give my 30-minute, 3,000-foot view of states. But let me start off, just because I'm a good lawyer, with my disclaimer. Nothing I'm saying represents opinions of my clients or is on behalf of any companies I may represent, because I do a lot of data breaches that involve states. I've done about 300 of them. Every single one of them is a little bit different, and so sort of my opinions are based on that. But so when you think about the state regulatory model, you sort of have to think about sort of the three buckets of pre-breach, breach notification, and then what happens post-incident. And I'm going to focus really on the first two for states. And in terms of pre-breach, what do companies have to do from a state regulatory perspective? Because as there are federal requirements, but there also are beginning to be state requirements. The most interesting one is sort of what companies are supposed to do when it comes to security. This is an area states haven't typically been involved in, but now, starting with California, who always seems to be leading the pack, including on presidential elections, except for this one, they've actually put together a requirement for these SIS controls, where you have to have the 20 SIS controls in place if you're a company doing business in California. There also are, when it comes to special data handling, state-level requirements. For example, some states have about one-third of the states have some of these sort of special security requirements. Massachusetts, California, Nevada are the ones that sort of come to mind. New York is solely focused on the financial services sector, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that later. There are states that are increasingly regulating social security numbers. So if you're a company that handles social security numbers, specifically, you have to handle the disposal of them using. Their states are regulating that area, and then also dealing with payment card information. States are, and there's about 16 states now that have regulated the use of payment card information, in addition to what's required under the federal statutes. There's some other areas states are beginning to get interested in, biometric and dealing with the disposal of HIPAA data are sort of the newest areas we're seeing state statutes come out. But really, the big piece that states have had sort of the what I would call sort of where they've decided to invest their time into is the state data breach notification process. And there are 48 different state data breach laws right now. The only thing they have in common is their differences, I would describe it as, because every state defines not only what personally identifiable information is a little differently. Some of them include social security number and addresses and names, but they also deal with what access and exfiltration have a different definition of what that means. And then lastly, or more importantly to companies that are going through this, they have a different notification process. So this means every state, some states like New Jersey, you need to get permission before notifying any of the victims. In the state of New Jersey, from the New Jersey Police Department. They're a very friendly organization and sometimes require some specific detail. And some states are very difficult in terms of the level of detail of the incident itself, like Vermont has historically, from our experience, been required a lot of information on the incident. So when you go, when you're actually in the middle of an incident, you have to start notifying individuals, you have to deal with these 48 different state approaches, which can be, complicated. It's an area that there's been a long discussion of federal preemption in, but so far that hasn't happened, and probably not likely over the next 4 years. But we never know. And then there is sort of a sort of the last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it back, is states are beginning to think about, the consumer issues and building FTC-like or Federal Trade Commission-like approaches to protecting their citizens from unfair business practices. And that's a new area that I think we're going to see more and more statutes in. And that's sort of what's happening at the state. There is sort of, the great westward expansion in cyber is also occurring at the federal level, where you have the defense sector, which has sort of since 2013 been starting to regulate the companies that are in the defense industrial base through a specific clause in a contract called the DFAR safeguarding rule, and we've also seen different versions of the energy sector thinking about this as well. But I don't want to go into too much detail.
That's good. And we'll talk about the financial sector here in a second, but I also wanted to press you a bit, Evan, and you do a lot of work with companies in response, and you outlined a bunch there that is potentially problematic because of the disparities in the way that the states are regulating and going after things. Are there particular sectors that are either particularly good or particularly bad when it comes to, and I know that's potentially a false binary, but deal with it for a second. When it comes to the way in which they are regulating a certain sector, certain industry?
So, I mean, well, I guess obviously all companies I work with are great and have never had any, nothing but stellar approach to compliance. But no, I do view the world as sort of the haves and the have-nots. And I've been using this example for a few years now, and it's beginning to break down. I used to say the haves are those that do sort of data security, information security. I was a system engineer at MITRE Corporation for a while, and I sort of felt like I was part of the haves world when I was a data scientist, and now as a lawyer, I'm definitely part of the have-nots, even though we have a very robust information security approach at Crowell and Mooring. We are not an IT company that's not our bread and butter. And that's really been changing now, because I think some of the have-nots have realized via both going through incidents and boards and their board focus that the data security and information security is everyone's problem, not just if you're a large IT company. To specifically answer your question, I think the defense sector, the financial services sector, and the energy sector really have been realizing that there are different aspects of information security and data security that they need to think about. And I'll just give you, maybe two examples from outside of financial services sector. I think the defense sector, post the events of 2004 through 2006, when there was a significant set of attacks against many defense companies, realized that when they need to protect their information systems and their data, it just isn't the 32 big tier 1 defense integrators. It needs to be the 30,000 members of their supply chain. And they very much took that approach to managing data security. And within the energy sector, they've realized that it's not just their business systems that you need to focus on. You need to focus on all of the infrastructure. And through a lot of really good work, through work with the regulatory and really on their own voluntarily, thinking about things like information sharing, I think the energy sector has realized that what I'll call this is it's sort of the power of the pack, not just because my last name is Wolf, but because there is sort of a herd protection here that if companies stick together, they can actually do a lot of reduce risk in a lot of ways. And we've seen this coming out of the critical infrastructure protection, SIP standards that the energy sector relies upon, and with their information sharing efforts. And so I think, in the sort of Frankenstein approach to cybersecurity, there are really good examples coming out of a few sectors where they've done it well. And just to be clear, I'm not going to answer the sectors that I don't think are doing it well.
Fair enough, fair enough. Which is a good segue, potentially, to talking a little bit about the financial sector.
A sector that's doing it well.
I was going to pass judgment. So, Heather, in September, New York proposed, and I believe the comment period ended a few weeks ago, a new financial sector regulation for cybersecurity. The regulation has been met with praise from some and grumblings from others. Can you take us through a little bit what's being proposed and what do you think of this model that the New York financial sector is trying to sort of adapt and create?
Sure. So by way of providing an intro to this, as Rob mentioned, I'm now with the Financial Services Roundtable in its technology policy division called BITS. Prior to this, I worked for governors at the National Governors Association for the last 7 years. So I have a deep appreciation for how governors and state legislatures approach the issue of cybersecurity. I think they focused a lot of time and attention on really trying to ensure that they are really helping protect their citizens. And they recognize that it starts with them. And so they're using that. You're seeing Tim Blute from the National Governors Association here today. They're using that to really highlight how deep of a challenge this is and how much we all need to be engaged in it. So understanding where states are coming from, everyone recognizes that cyber is a challenge. So I think everyone is now stepping up to try to do something on cybersecurity, whether it makes sense or not. So I think the challenge that we now face is, particularly for industries like financial services or like energy that are very heavily regulated to begin with, you have a plethora of disparate cybersecurity requirements that frankly are getting to the point that if they are not harmonized against something like the NIST cybersecurity framework, which was a multi-sector effort that really brought together stakeholders from a wide range of industries and backgrounds, government, private sector, if it's not harmonized off of something like that, you have the problem that everything starts to conflict and people are spending so much time and energy simply based on compliance that they are no longer able to spend the time and attention they need on securing critical networks and systems and the information that everyone cares about. So I brought with me a visual, and you probably won't be able to see it, but this is a spaghetti chart. This is from the Government Accountability Office. So we did not put this together. GAO put this together. This is for the financial sector specifically. Across the top, you've got about 15 different federal and state regulatory agencies. Along the side are 8 additional federal entities that have some role in cybersecurity. And I put that up there because it shows you the number of people that are involved and are not coordinating their efforts, but all have the same goal in mind. So from just the 2016 perspective for us at the Financial Services Roundtable, we've been tracking almost 30 different either proposed or new cybersecurity requirements facing the industry. NYDFS came out just a couple months ago with, was the first really state regulator to come out with a comprehensive set of regulations for cybersecurity. So if any financial firm operating within the state would need to meet a certain set of requirements. Many of them sound like basic cybersecurity things. So you need to have a cybersecurity program with a written cybersecurity policy that covers things like identity and access management, third-party risk management, how you're managing your vendors and your supply chain, have an incident detection system in place, and have an incident response plan. You need to have a CISO, a cyber information security officer specifically required. So it really is, it's very comprehensive, and this was the first state to really put out regulations like this. On its face, you would argue, well, why shouldn't you do those things? Those are really a comprehensive cyber risk management approach. Yes, but the challenge is it starts to get very prescriptive and takes a one-size-fits-all approach that does not work for, you've got very, very large international firms, and then you have smaller, mid-size, and regional banks that this has to apply to. And it starts to conflict with things like the NIST cybersecurity framework, which I think many of you in this room may have had a hand in helping pull that together. It's a really important document that helps you think through all the way from, little nitty-gritty systems up to your board, how you can talk about the risk life cycle. And our members have really worked to pull together a set of metrics for their own board reporting. Many of them report on cybersecurity risk matters quarterly at this point to their board and have implemented the NIST framework, and then one of the other major financial regulators. There are 3 of them that come together under what's called the FFIEC. They put out a different tool called the CAT, the Cybersecurity Assessment Tool, which was also very comprehensive and goes down to the control level. So you had NIST, you had the CAT tool. Now you have a new proposal coming out from NYDFS, and then you have yet another one that came out from some of the same FFIEC agencies that put out the CAT tool, proposing an even additional set on top of that. So the question simply becomes, where does this end? And we do run the risk of, the level of detail that firms are required to report to regulators is quite extensive. We at the federal level have seen several, similar to the OPM data breach. We've had regulators who have had data breaches. So it's a real concern and a risk that the more you require information to be reported to different places in different formats, you're taking the eye off the ball for your critical security professionals to perform their job. They're focusing on compliance instead. And it's a national security concern. You're creating honeypots of really sensitive information for a critical sector of the economy for attackers to really go target. So what we appreciated from the commission report that came out with Kiersten here earlier talking about was they actually highlighted this challenge in their report and called for all federal agencies, to follow the NIST framework, but then also for all federal and state regulatory bodies to really go back through the existing regulations and look at any new regulations that come out and harmonize that to the NIST cybersecurity framework. One of the additional things that they highlight a lot in that report is the need for public-private sector collaboration. And I think that that's really the area that we're in today, is you have such a quick pace of technological change that is in some ways making security better and faster and cheaper, but regulations need to be able to keep up with that, and oftentimes government policy tends to lag. So I think the more we can create forums for public-private sector collaboration and education, the better off we'll all be with that. And I know that was a little long, so sorry for that.
All good. There's a ton to unpack there. Quick follow-up for you, though, and Evan and David, feel free to jump in on this. What you described one of the problems with the financial sector regulations in particular as it taking a one-size-fits-all approach. What Evan described at the beginning there was this sort of Byzantine amalgam of regulations that everyone has to sift through. There's not necessarily contradiction there, but there's definitely a tension between creating regulation and legislation that sort of is harmonized across state borders and not pursuing a one-size-fits-all approach. What can you do, or what could states be doing better to sort of manage that tension?
I would say, I think, when you're talking about dictating to a firm how they secure their systems, you need to take a risk management approach. So I think, and that's what the NIST framework tried to do, is really to set out, here's the framework for how you should think about these issues in the life cycle. Then how you apply that specifically to a firm, there's some flexibility to make sure that you are, you're gonna know your systems best, and you're gonna know the information in them. So you need to do a risk analysis about what are the most critical systems to protect, and then compare that to what protections you may have, what mitigating controls you may have, and where you're accepting risk. The data breach issue, it's the same point though, where you have so many different competing requirements. Like the definitions that are used across states may be totally different. And when you're in the immediate aftermath of a breach and you're trying to notify people, making sure that you are complying with each of those different 48 definitions or whatever it may be, you're spending so much more time on trying to make sure that you're meeting all the multiple steps that New Jersey or Maryland or Virginia or New York or whoever may have, that you're not able to actually get the information out quickly and efficiently to those who need it. I think that the thing I would stress is the way to solve this, I think, is there's something at the federal level called CPAC. It's the Critical Infrastructure Partnership Advisory Council, thank you, which allows for regulated entities and their regulators, because there is sort of an adversarial relationship there, right? Regulators need to have an independent oversight function, and you don't want them being too cozy with industry. But at the same time, regulators need to also understand what the firms are seeing and how the technologies work from a day-to-day perspective. And without a forum for dialogue to allow that to happen, particularly from a national security standpoint, I think we're all doing ourselves a disservice. So that's something, and I'm not sure CPAC actually, Evan may know, applies to states and locals, but I think it's fora like that where you can have a dialogue and go, okay, we get it, we understand your goal, we actually share the same goal. What you're proposing doesn't work for this reason, here's how we would suggest doing it instead. I think there's a lot of opportunity in this day and age for more of that kind of engagement.
So I guess to answer the question, CPAC is a FACA-exempt advisory committee, to sound like a DC lawyer for a second. So when their meetings are not subject to the Federal Advisory Committee Act, and they can meet in private and have certain a lot of protection associated with that. It doesn't really follow through to the states. So, but there is some benefit there. I guess just because every cyber panel needs to have a cyber by analogy moment, I'm going to sort of answer your question with sort of my analogy of where the state data breach laws need to go in the future, and I'm going to use sort of the transportation sector, because I think the federal government has been very effective since the advent of the car and our sort of highway system at regulating the components of the transportation sector and still allowing states to sort of manage their own equities in their states well, where, we don't have a federal speed limit yet. We have, speed limits managed at the state level. We have, roadways and cars are manufactured by, up to a federal standard. And so we have, in the case of the transportation sector, the federal government involved when it's a safety and a security issue for individuals and organizations across the country. And that's both, personal safety and also what I would call regulatory liability issue. I mean, we couldn't have an organization like FedEx, or if we had every state managing the liability of the transportation sector within their state. And so we do need to evolve to a system where there is more of a blended responsibility between states and the federal government. It's going to take us a little while to get there. I know there's been a lot of talk of a federal data breach law. Unfortunately, I don't think it's quite that simple of just federal preemption in this space. I think that would actually, it would obviously solve a lot of problems, but it would create a lot of ancillary problems. And so I think we need to, and we will over time as we understand sort of how these breaches work and really what is the damages. And this is what the courts are dealing with right now, is every time, everyone in this room has, I no longer ask the question of who's received one of these letters, because everyone has. But, the new question is how many people understand what the impact of a data breach is to yourself? Have you been personally impacted? Has there been any sort of loss of money? Has your financial score been hurt in any way? And that's a question that sort of everyone struggles with, including the courts, with the exception of the Ninth Circuit that seems to have their own opinion on this. And so that's where I think we're going to have to think about is, not really what are the, what are the rules, but what are the effects and the consequences. And so that ends our cyber by analogy component of the talk.
Thank God. No offense. So we talked a little bit about, David, jump in.
Just one thing so I can get something on the record. I think that it's worth acknowledging that the reason we have 48 states, state laws on data breach, for example, is that the states, some of which are tired of waiting for the federal government to legislate in this area, and some states are actually innovating in this. And I think that one thing that we should understand is, there's a euphemism of states as laboratories of experimentation for a democracy. We should look across the 48 states and try and examine which states have innovated the most, so that if we contemplate any federal action at all, we should try and learn from what the states have been doing. And I think that goes to a bunch of other policy areas, not just cyber.
How does that apply?
That's a really important fact and something that,
How does that apply to the financial sector regs in New York, if at all, in your opinion?
Well, I think the thing with New York is not what they're trying to do, because I think much of what they propose is already in place in a number of firms due to existing law like the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act and other regulations. I think it's just the application and the level of specificity. And whether they realize it or not, I think there is dialogue with industry now happening on that. NYDFS, to their credit, said we should coordinate with other entities and we should put this out for comment, and have sought comment. Some of what they propose may actually undermine innovation, which may enhance security. For instance, there's a requirement to encrypt all data, regardless of where it stands or what's in it. Everything needs to be encrypted. Well, there's actually newer forms of security like tokenization that people are exploring, which may be more secure than encryption. Not to, shouldn't also forget the fact that with quantum computing and machine learning, very soon many of the encryption codes that we have today may no longer work. So to put something that specific in a regulation sort of can quickly become outdated and have the unintended consequence of stifling innovation. So I think the states, to David's point though, the states were getting tired of the federal government's inability to act. And in many sectors that's true. I think there are, for those like financial services and energy who by their nature are regulated from day one, I think it's somewhat more complicated. But setting that aside, the states really have sought to protect the consumers and protect their industry, because if something goes wrong, it is in their state. They're the ones that have to respond to that. And I have a deep appreciation for governors and the state mechanisms that are there to really protect their citizens and respond to this. And they are trying to do what's right. So I think everyone's head is in the right place. It's just sort of being cognizant of what came before you and what's happening to your left and to your right.
To your point about the sort of dynamism of best practices and the need to update that and then sort of juxtapose that with the rigidity of bureaucracies and therefore regulation, as you mentioned, one of the potential cures to that ailment that has been proposed here in DC and elsewhere is the concept of cybersecurity insurance in lieu of or in complement to regulation. Coincidentally, cybersecurity or insurance writ large is regulated at the state level. And David, I know that you've been working with DHS lately with the Safety Act sort of re-up, and I know that you've been thinking hard about the way in which the federal government liaises with the states, especially around insurance regulation. Could you talk a little bit about what's going on there and whether it provides a decent model for the way in which the two sort of federal level and state level interact?
Well, just a quick acknowledgement that insurance is one of those things that have been proposed as a source of solutions for cybersecurity risk management for many years, but has systematically underperformed in that we don't actually have broadly exploited or deployed insurance vehicles or mechanisms for critical infrastructures or industry to buy low-cost, efficiently provided insurance coverage for cyber breaches or broader integrity risks to critical data or critical systems. Now, there's some reasons why that's true. I'll just focus on one right away, which is the most commonly cited one, which is the absence of actuarial data on risk exposure and the absence of a robust data set that can show you which risk mitigation behaviors will have the highest return. Absent that, writing policies and pricing policies for cybersecurity risk insurance is very difficult. So you get niche policies, you get very slow growth in the amount of insurance policies that are written in this area. Some progress, especially recently, but not the broad insurance market that many people envisioned in the earliest days to allow critical infrastructure and private markets to take care of cyber risks without a substantial level of federal assistance. Now, there are some areas where I think some progress is possible, and one is the Safety Act, as was mentioned. Safety Act is a very old program in the cyber domain area anyway, which means it's more than 10 years old. What it does is it provides a liability cap to people who, in non-cyber areas I should say, because it's being used in a cyber area is embryonic in proposal. It provides liability caps for those who undertake measurably useful risk mitigation behaviors, plans, equipment design and equipment purchase and deployment in areas for counterterrorism. So the NFL is using the Safety Act for stadium security and for active shooter programs and evacuation programs regarding its particular fixed facilities. Other critical infrastructures are using it as well. In order to gain Safety Act protections or liability caps, one has to show that one has an actual measurably useful program for protecting citizens and assets from exploitation. Translating that to cyber would mean that you would have to have a concept or a protocol for evaluating real cyber preparedness from non-real or perceptive or paper plans, perceived plans that actually don't mitigate risk. And that's where, in a sense, the rubber hits the road. What are the characteristics of a real cybersecurity program that can mitigate risk against different classes of threat? After all, most of the niche risk insurance that's written has huge carve-outs for incident cyber events that are not covered. Many of those carve-outs cover nation-state level threats. So if one thinks that cyber insurance is a way to mitigate that class of threats, probably not in the current context. So what could the federal government do about that? Now, I was reading a paper by a friend of mine, Rob Kanacki, from the Council on Foreign Relations, sorry, a competitor.
Not a competitor.
This morning that...
complimentary.
Of course. That proposed, in a sense, preemptive federally backed insurance for critical infrastructures based on sort of it being an insurer or backstopper of last resort. I read that this morning. He continued that proposal by proposing something that is actually in the Commission report, which is a sort of cyber incident data analysis and repository that would, in return for qualifying for this sort of insurance, one would have to provide access to incident data and sort of root cause analyses on any cyber incidents, which distributed across sectors and across time would build an actuarial data set that would allow better and broader insurance products to be sold to critical industries. Now that strikes me as something that the Safety Act, which up until very recently is concentrated on physical security risk, expanded into cyber, could perhaps give us some progress on something that's been long cited as sort of the critical market-based solution for an area where we can't really regulate quickly or easily or efficiently. And that is increase the availability of critical infrastructure data on actual breaches, actual cyber incidents, as a way to build up a data set upon which risk calculations can be made. There are a number of areas where that might be applied, but to bring this back to the states do regulate in many areas non-cybersecurity, for safety, for environmental protection, for emergency preparedness, and for disaster recovery, many of which resemble risk classes that cybersecurity might overlap with. How about the states at least seeking to, I might add, in those areas, regulation leads to mandates, and one of the differences I have with this report is that it continues the current administration's focus on voluntary measures as a way to deal with strategic critical infrastructure problems. I think that is an approach that is probably reaching the end of its useful life, and that we need a different balance between voluntary measures and mandates. The states in many other policy areas have already bitten that bullet. Voluntary environmental regulation at the states is not exactly the leading approach. Voluntary safety regulation is not exactly the leading approach in much critical infrastructure oversight at the state level. In cybersecurity, I think it's an open question whether that should be the approach that the states adopt, absent federal legislation that is much more pervasive than what we got this year when CISA was passed. So for the purposes of insurance and for critical infrastructure cyber risk management, perhaps the states might use access to an insurance vehicle to, as a quid pro quo, in a sense, for those who seek insurance, providing critical data. And then you get right back to the creation of a data set that might be used by insurance risk pools to try and get at a conceptualized market mechanism for buying down risks. Again, this is not regulation as much as it is framing a market opportunity for risk mitigation by the states in leveraging experience they have in other areas.
Go ahead, Evan.
Yeah, sorry if I could just add like a two-finger comment, because I agree with David, and I'm both pro-Safety Act and pro-insurance, since I actually actively are working on a few Safety Act applications that are cyber right now and have for a while. And also have of the 300 data breaches I've done, a good percentage of them have been covered by cyber insurance. So I think actual data is great and will help the insurance companies make more money, and which is good, and offer more policies, and then they'll be able to insure more companies. So I'm good with that sort of whole OODA loop. But the other aspect of the cyber insurance market right now, and this is especially true for financial services sector and other sort of the sort of core critical infrastructure sectors, is during the underwriting process, companies are required to review their infrastructure, their policies, procedures. They're actually required to do things to make sure that they are ready for cyber insurance. And that is critically important, because I think what we've, the cyber problem isn't that much of a technology problem as it is a attention to the problem. And by that, the more we can get boards and CEOs, and that's why the creation of a CISO is so important, because the more focus you get on it, the more money you spend on it, the more likelihood it is for companies to be able to better manage their infrastructure and better survive the sort of modern day cyber assault. So what we're seeing coming out, to be very specific, what we're seeing coming out of insurance companies is reviewing policies, procedures, making sure that companies have the single most important thing a company can have, an incident response plan, make sure they have core governance. Do they do annual pen tests? These are all things that are happening during that underwriting process, and that sort of good for everyone. And that's why I do think I think they said there's about a $2 to $4 billion addressable market right now in the cyber insurance field. That's fantastic. And as more companies go through this, I think we'll see it improve. But I'm pro insurance. So
we could
just on that
quickly,
yeah. $2 to $4 billion in a $17 trillion economy, when you have critical infrastructures that have tens of billions of dollars of turnover, trillions of assets at risk, and hundreds of millions of customers, is minute relative to the size of the problem. Much as I think everything should be tried, I think that for insurance to really flower in terms of meeting its potential, we need a change, and that change, if it's not going to come from the federal level, needs to, again, back to the experimental laboratories of the states, perhaps a state, constellations of states, and private sector. There's a lot of public-private partnership potential here. To put together these mechanisms that can move the needle a little bit more so that we can talk about tens of billions of dollars worth of insurance being written versus 2 to 4, which, to be honest, in an economy our size, is a little embarrassing in 2016.
We could quickly,
So insurance is certainly one avenue, but I think the other thing here, which is almost quicker, is, for a number of our CEOs and the boards that are actively engaged in this, is you need to start thinking about security as a business enabler. This is critical to the functioning of state economies. So whether it's working from the governor's bully pulpit, working with local chambers of commerce, I think just that educational role that, like, hey, if you're the owner-operator of a business, are you connected to the internet? Probably. Do you want your business to continue to function? Probably. Well, you should probably do some basic due diligence on cyber. I think it's kind of a basic thing just from a personal standpoint if you're a business owner that, like, there are some good, easy steps you should do, and I think that states have potentially the best opportunity to help local businesses with that. I mean, the vast majority of our businesses are small and medium enterprises. They're at the state level. They're at the local level. That is a perfect opportunity, and it falls short of any, even for states to pass legislation or regulation, takes a long time. So I think this is a much quicker hit that would get us all, again, closer to our goal.
So the only precautionary principle there is then we're going to continue to end up with this tobacco road approach to cyber. I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, but, and I agree that it's the fastest and quickest way to get people going. And my brother's a doctor and has his own IT system. The first thing I did when he started his practice is got him out of the IT practice and said, go hire someone to do this. You're a good doctor, not a good IT manager. And so I agree. I am concerned about sort of what that looks like 5 years from now when we have every state and local, just to create our tension on our panel.
That's a way of approaching it from more of a, like, this is enabling your business as opposed to, like, here's a specific cyber requirement that you must do. Like, putting it more, the onus on the individual, and the individual responsibility piece is one that we haven't touched on too much here. It was highlighted in the Cyber Commission report, so I'll leave it at that.
So we could talk about insurance and risk management for literally days. One quick thing to tie it up from David, and then we're going to move to questions from the audience.
I just note that much as I think job-owning people into better individual cybersecurity behaviors is always useful, and I do want the states and everyone else to do that. I would note that we have been doing that for a long time to large portions of the American population and more broadly, and we don't have the use case for where that succeeded. So much as we should do that, we need all these other things as well, and I personally think that if you have IT, which is shipped broken, shifting the risk to individual users, expecting them through personal behavior and heroism to make up for the problems in devices like these is really not going to scale very quickly or very well.
So quickly, because we've already run over, let's take a couple of questions from the audience. We're going to take them all at once. We'll go right up here in the front.
Thank you. Terrific panel. My name is David. I'm from the National Governors Association. And it seems to me there seem to be two types of regulation. There's the proactive one, such as the NRC regulation that says you have to do all of this, and if you don't, we will de-license you, and you will be out of business. Then there's kind of the retroactive looking regulation, which is more like the FTC, where they say, okay, you got to do reasonable stuff, but if you screw it up, and you don't have to report to us what you're doing, but if you screw it up and we find out you weren't doing the basic stuff, we're going to penalize you. And I wonder if the FTC approach is a way to avoid the policy compliance issue where you're having a lot of your security people focusing on reporting requirements, having them focus on the security, but there's still the incentive to implement basic security measures, because if something goes wrong, then the regulators come at you after the fact and said, well, now we're going to penalize you a lot harder than we would have otherwise.
So I'm going to take 2 more questions, and we'll answer them in our final statement. So if we could go right here in front, and we'll go back to Sean in the back there.
Hi, my name is Karate. I work for a major cloud provider managing a cloud bank, so this is near and dear to what I do every day. My question is, as with respect to underwriting and insurance, has anybody thought about using like the flood model of FEMA, how they underwrite insurance, and then also possibly talking with such a small business association, if there's all these small and medium enterprises out there and they give money out to these businesses, that they actually guide them using SCORE and independent basically organizations to provide prescriptive guidance as opposed to proscriptive issues and things of that sort.
And then one last one in the back in front of Ian there.
Thank you. Sean Canuck, I'm an independent attorney. We've heard discussion of finance sector, energy sector, transportation sector. I'm curious if the panelists feel there are other sectors or critical infrastructures that aren't getting the attention they should be, either at the state level or in the new Presidential Commission's report. Last time I checked, there were 16 critical infrastructure sectors by DHS.
Or any sectors that might not be listed as critical infrastructure, but should be.
Perhaps.
Twitter.
So we've got 3 questions. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to respond to anywhere between 1 and 3 to wrap it up. We'll start with David. The proactive checklisting versus the penalties in the FTC approach, FEMA flood model for insurance, critical infrastructure.
Okay, I'm less familiar with the FTC versus NRC contrast. That's an interesting contrast. I would say that one problem with retroactive is that can mean that you actually can proceed with very few actual performance-based regs against which you would then judge retroactive performance. And that's a question: do we need fewer regs in cybersecurity, or do we need fewer best practices in cybersecurity against which people would assess? Intuitively, I think that's not what we need more of. So I guess that pushes me towards NRC, which is very, very restrictive, very prescriptive, and probably not optimal either. So I'm not sure where you should fit on that continuum. On the flood insurance point, this might be the first time I've heard flood insurance praised as a model for national policy. I'm not sure that
people that are flooded have to.
Well, you know, as a flood insurance policyholder in Florida, I'd say I appreciate that. But flood insurance as a model for cyber is not something, especially given the incentives issue we have with flood insurance in this country. I'm not sure that that's an approach I'd favor more for cyber. I guess I favor more one based on actual data on measurably useful procedures for risk mitigation and holding people and entities accountable for risky behaviors once we identify what they are, and writing insurance based on that. And I think scaling in sort of the way I discussed earlier is probably a better way to go. Last point, quickly, sectors that we haven't talked about yet that aren't in the report, and I think this is, given recent events, not treating the nation's election systems as a critical infrastructure in some way through a federal policy that takes that seriously is a serious omission in this report. I'm sure there are reasons why the report chose to not weigh in on that issue. I think that the states run elections in this country. States, local, territorial, and tribal jurisdictions do. And in recent events, we've had the federal government assist the states in cybersecurity of those infrastructures and key nodes, and I think that that's something that we need to do more of. I think there's a lot more lessons learned to be had in there that don't fit in this panel but would fit somewhere else.
Heather?
Okay, sort of in reverse order. I mean, other sectors not getting attention, I mean, we sort of think about it as the main 3, and then you funnel out from there. So the main 3 for my perspective would be, you know, energy, financial services, and telecom. And, my telecom friends might argue with this, but, everything that we're seeing from a cyber threat perspective travels over their pipes, if you will. So is there more information sharing and collaboration potentially with them in particular that would be helpful here for everybody? Some of them are trying to monetize that, which I think is kind of part of the issue. But that's a big one for me. As you start to look at innovation and things like self-driving cars, the transportation networks and all that, I think become an increasing importance in water systems, all that from a health safety perspective. But the election system is an interesting one. I know governors started talking about this with the federal government probably about 2 years ago as that there are potential threats. But I think the challenge there is states do each run their own, and the state secretaries of state that oversee that are oftentimes independently elected. So you've got like a whole different network of communications that need to start happening. The flood insurance, I think the issue with insurance is, and what NAIC at the national level for states is trying to do is start to collect more of that data. The industry's in its infancy yet, and so it's finding ways to collect more information on those threats and what happens. This is something that the FBI actually is looking for more information on as well from firms, but the issue in part is, those who put information in don't often see anything coming back out of it. And there is still the concern that if you're a private company and you are providing some of that information, that is going to come back to bite you if you don't have some additional higher level safe harbor kind of provision in so doing. On the last one on the proactive versus retroactive regulations, that is an interesting way of thinking about it. I'd have to look more deeply at the NRC and FTC models. I have heard some folks in our industry at least sort of highlight FTC as a better approach in some ways. Not that I think it's totally on the back end, because my understanding of much of what we deal with is throughout the life cycle, and regulators, when they come in on the back end, are looking through, and you have to show the documentation for everything you have done previously throughout that life cycle. You would get dinged on the back end if you failed to do something, but it is still sort of more risk-based and less prescriptive. Thou shalt do X. It is thou shalt ensure that X is protected, which I think is a better approach to doing that. So,
Evan, quickly if you can.
Yes. So on that first question, I actually started off my career as a geologist at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So I think their approach to regulating nuclear facilities is fantastic. I think if we're looking at what role regulations play, we really need to look at a multivariate analysis. And in short, I think it needs to look at a few factors. First of all, what is the goal of the regulation? If we look at how if we're regulating just sort of the protection of data or protection of networks versus increased reporting versus actually decreasing the likelihood of there being an incident, those are all completely different sort of endpoints, and we really need to think about what is the goal of the regulation. And if we're just trying to drive up increased spending or increased reporting, we can do that very simply. If we're actually trying to, as the financial services sector has been for a while, actually cut down on the amount of incidents that occur, then that's a different regulatory model. And I think not all sectors are going to be in the same way, and this is where, without making the multivariate analysis seem more complicated, we have a waveform that we need to look at each sector, because each sector is has a different maturity point. And then to answer both questions, both the flood insurance and the sector question at the same time, this really is a question of what are companies asked to defend themselves against. I still argue and have since I was at DHS that I work with a lot of pipeline companies. All of them would be devastated by a single Scud missile attack. Yet none of them have a Scud missile defense program, because we understand that the Department of Defense will protect all pipeline companies from inbound Scud missiles, and that's not a reasonable expectation. But yet they have to defend themselves against foreign nation states on a daily basis. So, but we can't say that the federal government's going to take on that whole threat themselves. There needs to be some company's responsibility of whether it's certain controls they need to implement or things they need to do. But there needs to be sort of this shared model of responsibility. And I think that both ties into what an insurance program looks like, because there is the federal component to this and an individual company component to it. And also it varies by sector. I've long been concerned about the vulnerability of our national monuments and icons as one of our critical sectors, but I'm not really concerned about their cyber impact right now. So I think, I think she got it right in terms of the sectors. I'd probably add defense and transportation as another two sectors that are pretty important in my perspective.
And that is a great way to end. We ran a little bit long, but join me in thanking these three for a great discussion.
Thank you to that panel. Now, as you'll have picked up, one of our themes today is the importance of state in public policy. So we thought we'd wrap up with a panel of people who actually work in states or work with states. And so if Dave, if I could ask you to come here. John, if you want to take the seat at the far end, Yachin and Tim, if you want to come in. Okay, well, we're just getting settled. Let me introduce the panelists. We have immediately to my right, Dave Weinstein, who is the Chief Technology Officer of the state of New Jersey. Previous to that, he was the Chief Information Security Officer of New Jersey and did various other jobs in the state. And before that, he did 3 years at Cyber Command. Hey, if I could ask people to be a little bit quiet, feel free to step outside. Next to him, we have Yejin Cook, who's the Director of Government Affairs at the National Association of State Information Officers. Previous to that, she was at the National Association of Counties. Tim Blute, who we've already met, is the Program Officer for Homeland Security and Public Safety at the National Governors Association. And finally, on the end, we have John Gilligan, who's the Interim CEO of the Center for Information Security, who, amongst other things, oversee the multi-state ISAC, which is a major information sharing organization between the states. First of all, I want to sort of thank everyone for sort of hanging on, particularly the panelists at this stage. I think we've had a very rich conversation, but there's a lot of strands we can pull on. I think the most effective way of kind of using this panel and summing up is to ask everybody from your various different perspectives, what are the states doing well, and what could the states do better? And feel free to range widely, but in terms of kind of focusing the discussion, you know, what can they take from the Commission report, and what will it be important to take forward? And let's go down the line. Dave.
Sure. Thanks, Ian. So just to kind of set the stage, I think it's important to recognize at the outset that states are indeed a very target-rich environment for malicious cyber actors, okay? Whether it's the public sector networks, the executive branch of state government, for example, that I oversee in New Jersey, or critical infrastructure networks, there are a lot of very attractive venues for malicious cyber actors. And in many cases, I can tell you from a firsthand experience that state governments know of these threats, to include threats ranging up to nation-state actors, well before the federal government knows about it. So from that perspective, we've gotten better over the last few years at identifying threats, at detecting threats, beyond just the perimeter. So it's one thing to be able to identify a malicious IP that's beaconing to Hong Kong or some other malicious place, but actually hunting within our networks to identify the so-called advanced persistent threat or anomalous activity. We've gotten better at that over the last several years. And likewise, we're getting better at sharing it, right? We're sharing it with the private sector. We're sharing it with partners like the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, with the federal government, and with other states. I think where we need to get even more better is in the incident response realm and operationalizing the public-private partnerships that states have developed over the last several years, not just with critical infrastructure partners, but also those small to medium-sized businesses. I can tell you that in the state of New Jersey, we are uniquely positioned as a state government to interact with businesses in a way that the federal government could not possibly scale across the nation. And that's not a derogatory statement by any means. It's just the reality of the way we're organized as a local government entity interacting with key players across all sectors in the state of New Jersey. So generally speaking, getting better at detecting threats, getting somewhat better at detecting the more advanced threats and sharing those threats, need to get better at incident response, need to get better at operationalizing our public-private partnerships.
Yejin, NACIO produced this fantastic report for over a number of years, which gives you an interesting sort of set of data. What have you learned from those reports, talking to the state-level CISOs about what is, not only what is working and what needs to work better, but also what is changing over time, what is failing to change over time?
Sure, thanks, Ian. Well, as Ian mentioned, we do produce this report every 2 years in conjunction with Deloitte. And I think you'll find in there a lot of great information about the trends in state cyber. The major findings from this report are that the governor-level awareness is on the rise, which I think it signals that CIOs, Chief Information Officers, are doing a better job of communicating the threat and justifying their need for resources. As many of you know, state and local governments, unlike the federal government, have to balance their budget. So what does this mean for us? Financially, we know that state governments are spending about 1% to 2% of their IT budgets on cybersecurity. So what are we doing well? I think what we're doing well is collaborating with our natural partners, and we are leveraging our existing resources to make the best efficient use of what we have. What we could do better is to communicate our challenges, and there are a number of them. Communicate our challenges to those people who can make those financial resources available, such as state legislators and governors. Our job is not to go out, our job is securing the state network and all of its components, as Dave has already mentioned. NACIO, we represent people like Dave, state CIOs across the nation and U.S. territories. They all suffer the same problems. In this report, you'll see that our top challenges are insufficient funding and lack of people. We don't have the people to do what needs to be done because state government tends not to be the most attractive place for young professionals and those graduating college, but we recognize that as a challenge. And just to quickly conclude on that question, what we are doing well, collaborating with our federal and state partners and those like MS-ISAC, and what we could do better is to communicate and justify the need so that we can get more of those resources to do a better job at securing our state networks.
Tim, you've thought about these questions in great depth, I've no doubt. What from your observation, have you been surprised, if you like, that states are doing well? And what are the areas, not just that states need to do better, but you think needs a little bit more attention drawing to it?
Sure. So, I've been really pleasantly surprised, and this builds off what Yejin was saying. I think the level of not just gubernatorial awareness around the threat, but I'll call it enterprise-wide awareness. When we bring up this topic, when we're out meeting in states, I'm always really surprised to see budget officers at the table, governors, legislative councils at the table, legislators at the table, not just the CIOs or the emergency response folks, which is, I would say, where the discussion was at maybe 3 or 4 years ago. You would either talk to the CIO or you'd talk to the National Guard or the emergency response, and they had sort of thought through on the CIO side, how do I protect the networks, and then the emergency response side, what do I do if there's a physical consequence? What we're seeing now is they're thinking about, how do I budget for cybersecurity? How do I grow my workforce? How do I protect the university networks, but also tie my universities to the jobs of the future? You're seeing governors' offices really focused in on this, asking the right questions. Who's in charge? Who has authority? Who has responsibility? What does this cost? What's budgeting look like? So I'm pleasantly surprised at the level of attention and awareness around that. One area I'd like to see more attention being paid, I think you're seeing it in some states, I'd like to see more, is on risk-based strategy. Not being as reactive, not just saying we've got a cyber threat, man, we've got to throw some people at it, we have to throw some money or some time at it, but really taking an in-depth look and saying, what are the cyber threats that my state faces? What are the assets that I need to protect? What are the quote-unquote crown jewels? What are the assets I have within my state that I can deploy? Maybe I've got a great research university or a federally funded lab. What are those? And then how do I devise a long-term strategy that meets those threats, that deploys the assets, and also thinks about where do I want my state in 5 to 10 years?
And finally, John, you've been at this cybersecurity business for some time. Based on your experience at the federal level and now working very closely with the states, what do you think? What do you think states can draw from the Commission report, particularly, as well as what you've been impressed by and what you'd like to see more of.
Okay, thank you, Ian. What I would echo many of the comments that have been made by the fellow panelists. The perspective, though, that I would encourage is that I think when you look at the state and local governments, what you find is an array of performance. There are some that are doing extraordinarily well, and so we, in managing the MSISAC, the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, find that some of the states and some of the local governments are just doing outstanding work. Our job then is to help harvest that and then share that with others. However, as was mentioned, there are many organizations that either because of the lack of just awareness, but in many cases the lack of resources, really have not been able to make significant progress. And so in those cases, they're sort of in what I would consider an equivalent to what we see across the nation in small businesses in particular and medium-sized businesses who are just either not large enough or don't have the resources to be able to apply the type of rigors and the type of technical solutions that you would ideally like. So I think that's what we see, sort of this sort of a spectrum of capabilities. And my comments then I think would lead to, Ian, you asked, you know, what should be done, what perhaps in the report is able to be taken. I think in the Center for Internet Security, one of our fundamental principles is to make best practice common practice. And so one of the things that we have been spending a lot of time really since inception is trying to identify what are the specific and measurable efforts that will make a significant difference in cybersecurity. And so as a result, we have developed a set of controls that these were developed out of partnership with the National Security Agency and a wide variety of organizations. And the controls basically align with the risk patterns that we're seeing nationwide. And so we are very strongly encouraging organizations. California now has adopted the critical controls as sort of a baseline for security. We call it sort of good hygiene. As another example, just last week, Department of Defense indicated that over 90% of the intrusions into defense networks and industry networks supporting defense are as a result of lack of basic hygiene. So all of the things that we talk about in terms of policy and risk management, et cetera, are good, but ultimately they have to get down to what specifically you're going to do. And so I think that's where I would recommend, you know, things like the critical controls, which include, you know, fielding, for example. Another one of the areas that we work is configurations for standard software packages that allow them to be more secure. As was mentioned in the previous panel, software that is delivered today by our vendors is insecure, fundamentally insecure. And we have had a federal acquisition regulation for a long time now that says you will use the NIST checklist, which includes a lot of the Center for Internet Security standards, but they're not. And so I think there's a lot of fundamental, basic, good hygiene, good practice things that, in addition to what's already being done, I think would help move things forward.
So just playing off that a little bit, Dave, you are the Chief Technology Officer, having previously been the Chief Information Security Officer in New Jersey. Building off the sort of Commission's focus on research and development, what do you see as opportunities for states like yours in terms of using technology, the realms of authentication and other things that are brought out in the report that could make your job easier and have impacts for the people who live in your state?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And I think John hit on a great point, which is that we really need to focus on getting back to basics and the blocking and tackling of information security and cybersecurity at the state level, particularly when we're talking about government as an IT enterprise, right, or a business enterprise. For us, there's a lot of opportunity in that realm, and it's really gets down to basic vulnerability management, right? We have tens of thousands of endpoints across state government, both in Trenton and across the state, across dozens and dozens of agencies, some very big, some very small. We need to get back to the basics of making sure that the software we're procuring is up to certain security standards, and that we're continuously updating that software to make sure that it's patched to the latest vulnerability, patched for the latest vulnerabilities. So there's an awareness piece to this, certainly, that we need to have both the threat intelligence coming in and the vulnerability advisories coming in to be able to disseminate this information and share with the right parties. But we also need to embed this thinking into the culture of our governments, whether it be within the IT department or on the business side. And my perspective as a former CISO who's now overseeing all information technology for the state of New Jersey is that we will never as a state have sufficient IT resources to manage this problem. And unless we equip the users, the people actually operating the endpoints, who are generally not security practitioners, with the information they need to lock down these systems, then we're going to continue to be vulnerable. So the basic principles of vulnerability management is a huge opportunity for us within the state of New Jersey, and I think across many states in the nation.
Tim, just sort of playing off that, can you give us some examples that you've seen in the course of the last year of states who are doing really great work in sort of key areas? Dave, as we know, has done great work in setting up the information sharing within New Jersey. But what other examples can people draw on as good practice to take away and look at in implementing some of the report's recommendations?
Sure. I'm not going to miss the opportunity to applaud Dave's work in New Jersey, because what they started there with the New Jersey Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Cell has really become a trend. I can't tell you how many states we talk to, we go work with, who say they've heard Dave speak, they've looked at the New Jersey model, and they want to stand up their own integration cell of some kind. So that's one thing we're seeing nationwide. They're taking different forms, which I think is exciting, because what works for New Jersey isn't necessarily what works for Oregon or for Utah. But that's one thing I've seen, and there's probably 4 or 5 states currently I know of that are looking into it. Some of them are information sharing, some of them are just policy integration centers, some of them are academic centers for research or R&D. So that's one thing I'm really happy with. I would encourage everyone to look at Iowa's cybersecurity strategy. So one of the things I pointed out was that we need more strategies. Well, Governor Branstad had asked his team to put together a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy. They did so. They had it vetted. They worked with private sector partners, with the federal government, announced that strategy, and that's really driving a lot of their cybersecurity decision making. And then on the last issue, and I'm not going to call it any particular state, but I think around the response planning. Dave brought this up earlier. We've seen Michigan's on version 2 of their published cybersecurity response, disruption response plan. A lot of the states that we're working with are taking that as a model and beginning to draw out their own plans, accepting that it's inevitable that something's going to go wrong in cyberspace for them. And this doesn't have to be, an end of the world scenario. It could be relatively minor, but something's going to go wrong, so they need a plan. So there are a lot of states working on drafting those plans, sharing those plans, and then I would say most importantly, exercising those plans. So the first time they get used isn't when something happens. So just 3 sort of small trends, examples I'm seeing.
John, what's your thoughts on that? I mean, you're another organization that sort of sees across a widespread. What are the things that maybe don't get seen quite so clearly from DC that we could learn from, and other states can learn from too?
Yeah, again, I'd echo the comments that have been made thus far are all good ones. What I would add is, and I think this does tie back to the Commission's report, is the potential of providing a capability in the state and local governments for those organizations that either don't have the resources or the technical talent to be able to provide security, to have a cost-effective solution that they can get. Now, DHS has funded the Center for Internet Security to provide, we sort of call it basic cable. We provide a managed security service for a subset of all the states. And we found that enormously valuable, and that's been helpful. But that same concept doesn't have to be CIS. It could be others. It could be done within the states. And it's parallel to the Commission's report that's suggesting something similar at the federal government level. It's saying we ought to consolidate our network management. Obviously, the reason for that is so that you can overlay security on top of that. And so I think that concept is probably the only way I see that we're going to be able to really make rapid progress and to deal with the quote have-nots that really are going to continue to struggle in this domain is to provide something that's cost effective. You benefit from the scale of large organizations. That's one of the things. DHS pays us a certain amount of money, so we have scale, we can do this. But other organizations could do something similar.
One of the things that we have heard a lot about in sort of talking to states is this challenge of consolidating legacy systems and one thing and another. And one of the things, picking up on John's point, there's clearly opportunities in consolidation and what have you. One of the things we've also heard is that there may be a role for the federal government in helping states sort of do this. What opportunities do you think there are for the next administration and to help states help themselves?
I'm glad you asked that question. I'll eventually get to my point, which is about federal security regulation and harmonizing those. Exciting, I know. Take a little breath before we talk about that. But consolidation is a big priority for our CIOs, as Dave can tell you, because managing legacy systems, managing these old things little bit by little bit by little bit is a waste of it's a waste of resources when it could be. When we're looking at an enterprise, that is the ideal situation we want to have. We want to have enterprise-wide security solutions and visibility. Dave can speak to probably his specific experience in that, but when we survey our CIOs, we ask them to list their top 10 priorities. For the past 5 years, security has been number one. And second place is usually cloud services or in consolidation. We are, again, think about the background in which we work. We are resource limited. We are almost kind of a self-funded organization because we're a chargeback organization. So we have to make use of those things that we already have. And in order to leverage our resources, we seek consolidation because it allows us to see more than just the little pieces, fragmented pieces that are kind of in existence today. So how can the federal government help us? Well, of course, you can help us with grant funding. We would love that. Anybody who wants to find a few $1 million in the federal budget, come talk to us. But another specific thing that the federal government can help us with is harmonizing disparate federal security regulations. Somebody Heather on the previous panel mentioned kind of the array of regulations to which the financial sector must abide. Well, our CISOs, Dave formerly being one, I think you can understand that there are several security regulations that our folks have to comply with that make the vision of consolidation a little bit tougher. I know we don't have a lot of time to get into all of those today, but just know that our CISOs have to not only deal with their own state kind of regulations, they also have to deal with IRS 1075, FBI CJIS, child support regulations, CMS, HIPAA, all of those things we are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Yes, these all map to NIST, but that doesn't mean there aren't problems along the way when we are thinking IT. It tends to be a little bit of a barrier. So if we could work on the grant funding and harmonizing security regulations, I think we'd be really excited people.
And just to piggyback on that, that's a great point. And there is a key distinction here that there's really a natural symbiotic relationship between IT consolidation, particularly for organizations that are heavily dependent on legacy systems, and enhanced cyber risk management and ultimately enterprise risk management. We in New Jersey certainly, and I think a lot of CIOs share this opinion, we believe that we could drastically reduce our cyber risk by moving off a lot of these legacy systems. Not only is it cheaper, not only is it easier to defend, but the technology is simply better. We talk a lot in the IT space about everything as a service. So we have software as a service, we have infrastructure, platform as a service. We're getting to the place in the security world where we're starting to offer, as enterprise IT service providers, cybersecurity as a service. And that cuts across all three of the other as a services, so SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS. Security has to be built in to the service offering, and we can get to that if we start upgrading our systems, consolidating and moving away from legacy platforms that are really hard to manage, really cumbersome to manage, and expensive. The myth that old technology is safer because the hackers don't know how to break in is just that. It's a myth. There is really no data to support that. So we're working hard in New Jersey. I know other states are, and NASCIO and MSISAC, as well as NGA, have been big partners to really consolidate our infrastructure footprint and upgrade these legacy systems.
So I know at least one of our panelists has a hard stop. So I'm going to very quickly check if there are any questions from here. And if not, I'm going to end with one question and we'll come down the thing. As a wrap up, in the first session we heard about the report for the President, the Commission report, and how that's going to be taken forward. In the second session we heard about the sort of role of states in building the national workforce from education, from the K-12 sort of right up. In the third session we heard about the role, the often underappreciated role of the states as sort of regulators, and here we've heard a little bit about the role of states in looking after citizens' information and the critical infrastructure within the states. Given the perspectives that you guys face, what's the one request, suggestion, desire you have for the incoming Trump administration as it applies to sort of cybersecurity at the state level? And we'll start with John and we'll work down towards David.
I only get one?
You can have as many as you like, but I don't want to keep you from dinner for lunch for too long.
So to me, the one area that it's not addressed in the report, and it's absolutely critical, is the federal government is probably the only organization has significant clout to really deal with the fundamental insecurity that exists in the products that we buy, and our IT products. And so, through both as a bully pulpit and then I think really setting expectations. So when I was a CIO, I wanted to get warranties on software. And I went to my lawyers, and the lawyer said, this is why you can't do that. That was a number of years ago. We need to move to that point where if you buy software, you buy an IT system, you buy an Internet of Things device, that you have an expectation of a certain level of security. And I think the federal government is the only place where that can start. I think beyond that, I think the recommendation that was in the report in fact, it was in the Homeland Security report, to simplify. We have too much. Organizations are struggling trying to figure out, what do I need to do? And they get lots of advice and support. They need education in some cases, but then they need to know some simple things. What do I do that'll actually make a difference? So I think, and again, I emphasize, we think that sort of fundamental things like cyber hygiene is really where you ought to start and grow from there. And there's lots of other things, but those would be the two that I would suggest. Thank you.
I think my one main suggestion would add on what I said this morning, which would be helping to clarify roles. I think when you ask a lot of the folks that we deal with, who's the right person in the federal government or what's the right agency, for the same question, you could get 4 or 5 different answers. So I think in the process of continuing to elevate the cybersecurity discussion at a national level, encouraging the federal agencies to identify where their lanes are and to communicate that effectively across the country would be helpful. And that can be both in law enforcement, in response, in information sharing, and then in regulation as well. I think there's just not enough clarity on who owns what piece of the cybersecurity policymaking, and then not enough communication when those decisions are made.
I think one thing that we would like to ask, it wouldn't be money or people, I think that we would like to ask for recognition that IT enables digital government. What people expect of Amazon, they will soon expect of government. And we would like to ask the Trump administration to consider states as partners, not top-down, not paternalistic regulation, abiders, but we are really your partners. We implement your programs. And if you could recognize us as a partner from the get-go, I think we would have a much successful nationwide and state cybersecurity posture.
Thank you. And to round up, sure. David.
So as we move into this next administration, I think there's a real opportunity for the federal government to recognize that they can't afford not to leverage state governments for the purpose of threat intelligence and for the purpose of public awareness campaigns. As I said at the outset, we are a rich target environment. We have a lot of intelligence that the federal government could leverage if it were shared properly and if those processes were in place. We are natural interlocutors with the private sector community in our respective jurisdictions. And lastly, I would say there's an often neglected conversation about the vulnerability of municipal and local critical infrastructure assets, whether they be water treatment plants or small electrical facilities. As we progress in the Internet of Things world, these critical infrastructure assets are increasingly interconnected with larger critical infrastructure assets. Right now, states are not very mature as it relates to helping to secure those municipal level and state level assets. We need to mature in that space and do so in close partnership with the next administration.
Dave, thank you very much. That's a perfect way to end. I'd like to just cap this off by thanking this panel, thanking our previous panels and panelists, by thanking you, particularly those people who've stayed with us throughout the morning and those people who've been watching on the live stream. We very much appreciate you being with us. I would also add that this is an ongoing project for us at New America. In the course of 2017, we're going to work on a series of reports looking at cybersecurity at the state and indeed the local. We focus probably less at the municipal, county level, city level, focusing on what the states, cities do themselves, their role in protecting citizens, their role as regulators and legislators, and fourthly, their role as enablers, focusing on education, economic development, what have you. And we're very keen to engage with anybody out there who is working on these issues and keen to engage in sort of public policy discussion around them. As I said earlier, we're also going to be continue to engage on the commission report and how that goes forward and working with the new administration, both in relation to the federal level and the state and local level. But for now, once again, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.